Hey everyone, nearly 95% of people who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot. Also, be sure to give the video a like and drop a comment below. Your interaction helps more people discover the channel and supports its growth. Thanks a ton for being here. By the way, I'd love to know which country or city are you watching from? I remember that day because it started like any other slow farm morning, the kind where the sun is already warm, but the air still feels clean and damp from the night. I was working through my normal list of chores, fixing a fence line near the drainage ditch, checking the pumps, listening to the low, steady sounds that mean everything is working the way it should. My grandbaby and her babysitter were restless that morning. They were always outside kids, never wanted to sit still, always looking toward the fields and the water like there was something better waiting out there. The sitter was young, only 13, but she had a calm way about her. She had grown up around animals and knew the land well enough to respect it. The baby was 5, curious and fearless in that way only little kids can be. They decided to hike across the farm lots to the beach by the sound. It was a familiar path, wide open fields broken by patches of scrub and drainage ditches. Nothing fancy, but still far enough that I always watched them until they were out of sight. The sitter packed a backpack with care. Towels, snacks, water, a little jar of Nutella, bread wrapped in wax paper, sunscreen. My wife had bought them these oversized sun hats that looked ridiculous but worked perfectly. Both girls wore bathing suits under their pants, so they could swim and then dry off in the sun. I saw them head out, their shadows long on the grass. Our 2 mastiffs followed right behind them, big heavy dogs that moved slow but watched everything. They were gentle with the baby, but serious about their job. We also had the duck. That duck had been with us since it hatched. One wing never worked right, so flying was never an option. My wife kept him the mud porch, fed him scraps, talked to him like he was another kid. He thought he belonged everywhere we were. When the girls started walking across the yard, the duck waddled after them, feet slapping the grass. The baby scooped him up like she had done 100 times before. He tucked his head in, calm as could be. He always wanted food, always watching hands and pockets. Nutella on toast was his weakness. I watched them disappear across the field, the dogs flanking them, the duck riding like he owned the place. I went back to work, but I kept glancing toward the open land. That beach access sat beyond a non-planted area, a strip of ground we left alone most seasons. People knew about it, even though it wasn't marked. Most days it stayed quiet. Later on I learned what happened while they were gone. The picnic went fine. They ate until they were tired and sticky. The water was cool but calm, enough to splash and float without worry. The baby fell asleep on a towel while the sitter sat nearby, watching the dog's pace. The strange thing was how the dogs acted around the duck. They kept shifting their bodies, lining up, placing themselves between the duck and the open land. Every time the duck moved, they adjusted. It wasn't playful. It was controlled and focused. The duck would make a short, sharp sound, not loud, just enough, and the dogs would tighten their circle. It looked almost planned. Then the other 2 dogs from home came running down, kicking up dust, drawn by instinct or noise or something none of us could name. That changed the feel of things. The sitter decided it was time to head back. She didn't like how wound up the dogs were acting, and she didn't want the baby walking back cold and wet. She stripped off her wet clothes, pulled on her t-shirt and sweats, packed up fast. The duck got handed back into the baby's arms. The dogs fell into line, and they started home. I was cutting the drainage ditches when I saw them coming. The tractor rattled under me, the smell of diesel and wet dirt heavy in the air. I saw the hats first, then the dogs, then the small shape of the baby. I drove the tractor over, planning to save them some walking. As I slowed, notes changed around me. The birds went quiet. The dogs stiffened. I looked up across the non-planted area toward the beach access. That was when I saw him, a full-size person running hard across the open ground. Not jogging, not wandering, running with purpose, head down, arms pumping. He wasn't dressed for swimming or fishing. Dark clothes, long sleeves, even though it was warm. He cut across the land like he knew where he was going, like he had been waiting for something to break. My stomach dropped. I didn't stop the tractor right away. I watched him for a few seconds too long, try to understand what I was seeing. He didn't look at me. He didn't slow down. He vanished into a line of brush on the far side. I got the girls on the tractor and took them straight home. I didn't let them walk. I didn't slow down. I watched the mirrors the whole way back. Once they were inside, I locked the doors, shut the animals in, and called for my field hands. These were men who knew the land as well as I did. Men who didn't panic but didn't ignore things either. We went back out together, spread out, moving toward the beach access from different angles. The ground told a story if you knew how to read it. Fresh footprints pressed into soft soil where there shouldn't have been any. A place where grass was bent down, not by wind or animals, but by someone standing still for a long time. The closer we got to the water, the more signs we found. Trampled reeds. A crushed beer can push down into the mud. The smell of sweat and old smoke hanging in the air. Near the edge of the access path, we found where someone had been sitting, hidden just enough to see the beach and the open field. From there, a person could watch anyone coming or going. That spot lined up too well with where the girls had been. It lined up too well with where the duck and dogs had been moving. We didn't find the person. He was gone by then. But we found enough to know he hadn't been passing through by accident. He had been there a while, waiting, watching, maybe planning something, maybe just feeding some dark curiosity. It didn't matter. The danger was real. When we went home, the dog stayed tight around the baby for the rest of the day. The duck never left her side. He sat closer than usual, eyes sharp, body tense. The dogs responded to him like he was giving orders, shifting when he shifted, blocking paths without being told. That night, I walked the fence lines again, double-checked locks, added lights where there hadn't been any. The next day, I filed reports and made sure people knew the area was watched. The beach access stopped being quiet for a while after that. What stays with me is how close it was. How a normal day almost turned into something else. The girls didn't know how near the danger had come. They just knew the dogs acted strange and the duck wouldn't relax. Animals feel things before we do. They don't need proof. They don't need reason. They just react. The man never came back. Maybe he realized he had been seen. Maybe he picked another place. I don't know. What I do know is that the dogs and that strange broken-winged duck did exactly what they were supposed to do. They slowed things down. They made noise. They changed the timing just enough. The ending is clear to me every time I think about it. There was someone back there who did not belong. He was close enough to run when he realized eyes were on him. If the girls had stayed longer, if the dogs hadn't closed ranks, if the duck hadn't kept them alert and moving, the outcome could have been very different. That day ended with everyone home safe, doors locked, land secured, and a hard lesson learned about how fast peace can turn thin. Last summer, I was still keeping the same routine I had followed for years. Up before the sun, leash on the dog, out the door before the day had a chance to heat up. My dog was old by then, a mixed mutt with a gray face and stiff hips, but he still liked his walks. I lived in a semi-rural area, the kind of place where houses sat far apart and the forest pressed in from every side. Wildlife was part of daily life. I had seen bears cross the road, coyotes trot along fence lines, bobcats slipping through the brush like shadows. Once, years earlier, I had even found cougar tracks in the mud near the creek. None of it shocked me anymore. You learn how to live around it where you don't live there at all. That morning was early, around 5:30, just like always. The sun was still hidden, and a thick fog had settled in overnight. It was the kind of fog that soaked your clothes and swallowed sound. Everything looked soft and blurred, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. I remember thinking it was beautiful in a quiet way. The air was cool, almost cold, and it felt good in my lungs. I had on light shoes and a thin jacket, already planning to turn part of the walk into a short jog once my dog warmed up. The usual route took us along a gravel road that curved gently downhill and then ran alongside a forested ravine. The ravine dropped off sharply, thick with trees, brush, and fallen logs. A narrow stream ran at the bottom, but you could never see it from the road, only hear it on clear days. That morning, the fog hid everything past a few yards. Even the tops of the trees disappeared into white. We were moving at an easy pace. My dog sniffed as he always did, slow and methodical, stopping at the same fence posts and rocks. His leash was loose. His tail wagged low and steady. Nothing felt strange at first. No sudden silence, no feeling of being watched. Just the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the quiet sound of my dog breathing. About halfway along the ravine, everything changed in an instant. My dog stopped so fast the leash snapped tight. He planted his feet right in the middle of the road and refused to move. At first I thought maybe his hip had locked up or he had caught a scent he really liked. I gave a gentle tug on the leash, expecting him to follow. He didn't. Instead, his body stiffened. His ears went straight up, higher than I'd ever seen them. His tail dropped and went rigid. Then the growl started. It wasn't the low warning growl he used with other dogs or the half-hearted noise he made when a bear crossed too close to the yard. This was different. It came from deep in his chest and stayed steady, like it was being forced out of him. His lips pulled back, and his teeth showed. His whole body leaned forward, every muscle tight. I felt a rush of cold go through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I followed his gaze, staring into the fog at the edge of the ravine. I couldn't see anything. The trees closest to the road were faint shapes, their trunks fading into gray. The drop-off into the forest looked like a wall of white. Then I heard it. The sound came from down in the ravine. It was loud, sudden, and violent. It rose up out of the fog like something alive. It was a scream, but not a high scream. It was deep and rough, layered with a snarl that rattled in my chest. It didn't sound injured or surprised. It sounded angry. It went on longer than any animal noise I had heard before, dragging out and then breaking into harsh, broken notes. My dog lost his mind. He lunged forward, straining against the leash, barking and snapping into the fog. Spit flew from his mouth. His growl turned into a wild, desperate noise. I had never seen him react like that. Not to bears, not to coyotes howling at night, not to anything. His fear was total, and it poured straight into me. My heart started hammering. I stood there frozen for a second, trying to force logic into the situation. I ran through possibilities in my head. A bear could make some awful sounds, especially if surprised. A cougar scream could sound terrifying, almost human. Coyotes could make a mess of noise, but this didn't sound like a group. It sounded like one thing, big and close. The fog made everything worse. I couldn't see if something was climbing up out of the ravine or pacing just below the road. I couldn't tell distance or direction. All I knew was that whatever made that sound was still down there, hidden, and my dog wanted nothing more than to either attack it or get as far away as possible. Another sound came, shorter this time, like a guttural snarl followed by a heavy exhale. The brush below the road rustled. I heard branches snap, slow and deliberate. That was enough. Instinct took over. I yanked hard on the leash and tried to pull my dog back toward home. He resisted, still barking and lunging. I panicked. I knew staying there was a bad idea. I also knew my dog wasn't thinking clearly. I used my foot and kicked him in the side, not hard enough to hurt him badly, but hard enough to shock him. I hated myself for it, but it worked. He stumbled, turned, and then bolted. We ran. The gravel road felt endless, even though it wasn't. My lungs burned as I sprinted, dragging my old dog along as he ran harder than I'd seen him run in years. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fog behind us felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing forward. I expected to hear something chasing us, heavy footsteps or another scream, but all I heard was our own movement and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The gate to my property came into view like a lifeline. I fumbled with the latch, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the leash. My dog pushed through as soon as it opened, and I slammed it shut behind us, sliding the bolt into place with a sharp metallic click. We tore up the driveway, shoes and paws slipping on gravel, until the house was right there in front of us. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, chest heaving. My legs gave out, and I sank into a chair in the kitchen, shaking from head to toe. My dog paced for a second, then jumped up onto the bench beneath the front window. He stood there rigid, staring out into the fog, growling under his breath. His hackles were still raised. Even safe inside, he couldn't relax. I sat there for a long time, tried to slow my breathing. The house was quiet. No more sounds came from outside. The fog eventually thinned as the sun rose, but I didn't move. I kept replaying the noise in my head, trying to match it to something familiar. I had heard cougar screams before, far off and echoing. This was deeper, more forceful. I had heard bears huff and roar. This felt more focused, more aggressive. Later that day, once the fog was gone, I went back out with a clear head. I stayed on my property and never went near the ravine. I didn't find tracks, but the ground was dry and rocky, bad for prints. I didn't notice broken branches down the slope, fresh and snapped clean. Something big had moved through there recently. In the days that followed, I talked myself into explanations. A lone cougar, a startled bear defending a carcass. Something normal, something known. That was easier than sitting with the raw fear I had felt. But my routine looked different after that. I stopped walking that route in the early mornings. I carried bear spray on every walk. I paid closer attention to my dog, trusting his reactions more than my own confidence. My dog never forgot either. Every time we went near that stretch of road, even in full daylight, he slowed down. His ears went up. His body tensed. He watched the ravine until we passed it, and only then did he relax. I have had other wild animal encounters in my life. Close ones. Dangerous ones. None of them dug into me the way that morning did. It wasn't just fear of being hurt. It was the feeling that I had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time, that something down there knew we were there and did not want us there at all. Whatever made that sound stayed in the forest. I never saw it, and I never want to. All I know is that my dog reacted like he was facing something he could not fight and could not understand. That alone told me enough. Some warnings don't come with clear answers. They just tell you to leave while you still can. And that morning, I listened. We picked that trail because it was easy and familiar. It was one of those national forest hikes everyone in the area knew about, the kind people recommend to families and out-of-towners because it has a payoff early on. A wide dirt trail, steady but gentle elevation, tall trees that keep the sun off your head, and a waterfall a couple miles in that empties into a clear swimming hole. On warm days, it feels more like a park than wilderness. Kids splash around. Dogs pull on leashes. People sit on rocks eating snacks and taking pictures. That was the scene when we started that morning. It was late spring, warm, but not hot yet. The ground was still soft in places from snowmelt higher up. The forest smelled damp and green, like crushed leaves and wet dirt. My wife and I were in no rush. We had packed water, some food, nothing fancy. Our dog was in heaven from the first step. She always was on trails. Nose down, tail up, weaving back and forth, stopping every few seconds to smell something that meant nothing to us, but everything to her. She was a tough dog too. Strong, confident, never jumpy. Fireworks barely bothered her. Thunder didn't faze her. I trusted her instincts because she didn't scare easy. The first couple miles went by fast. We passed groups coming back down from the waterfall, everyone wet and smiling, some barefoot, some carrying towels. We reached the falls ourselves and stopped for a bit. The water was loud there, crashing down into the pool, echoing off the rock walls. People were everywhere. It felt safe, familiar, normal. After a while, we decided to keep going. Past the waterfall, the trail narrowed and climbed. The dirt turned to rock and roots. You had to watch your footing. The climb wasn't extreme, but it was enough to stop most people who just came for the view and the swim. Within minutes, the sounds of the waterfall faded. The air felt cooler. The trees grew closer together. The light changed. That filtered green shade took over, the kind where everything feels slightly muted. We kept going. A mile, maybe two. I wasn't checking my watch. At some point I realized we hadn't seen another person in a while. No voices, no footsteps, no distant laughter. Just the sound of her boots, the dog's tags, and the forest itself. Wind in the canopy. Birds calling somewhere above us. The soft crack of branches shifting under their own weight. I remember thinking how fast the place had changed. One moment it was crowded and loud. The next it felt like we had slipped behind a curtain into something older and quieter. I didn't feel scared then. If anything, it felt peaceful, like we had earned the solitude by going a little farther than most people were willing to. Our dog was still enjoying herself, pulling ahead, pausing to sniff. Every so often she would look back at us, eyes bright, like she was checking to make sure we were keeping up. Everything about her body language said confidence, then stopped all at once. We were in a stretch where the trail ran through dense trees and thick brush. Ferns and young saplings crowded the edges. Visibility was limited. You couldn't see far ahead or off to the sides. The dog was walking in front of us when she suddenly froze. Not slowed down, not hesitated. She stopped like she hit an invisible wall. Her body went stiff. Her head lifted. Her ears went forward. She stared straight down the trail. At first I thought she had seen a squirrel or a deer. That wasn't unusual. But then she didn't move. Not an inch. I gave the leash a gentle tug, expecting her to snap out of it. She didn't. Her muscles were locked. Her tail, usually wagging or at least relaxed, dropped low and tight. We stopped too. The forest went quiet in that strange way that makes you notice the quiet. No birds calling. No wind moving leaves. Just stillness. I listened hard, trying to pick out something specific. A branch snapping. Heavy footsteps. Breathing. Anything. I heard nothing. The dog started to whine. Soft at first, then more urgent. She shifted her weight backward and pulled on the leash, not sideways or forward, but back the way we had come. She kept her eyes fixed ahead the entire time. She did not want to turn her back on whatever she was looking at. That was when the feeling changed in my stomach. I had never seen her act like that before. Not once. She wasn't curious. She wasn't alert in a hunting way. She was scared, pure and simple. The kind of fear that doesn't come from a loud noise or a surprise, but from something that feels wrong. We stood there longer than we should have. Part of my brain was trying to explain it away. Maybe there was an animal ahead. A bear, a mountain lion, a coyote pack. Those thoughts at least fit into known shapes. Known dangers. Things with rules. But the longer we stood there, the more wrong it felt. There was no smell of rot or kill in the air. No sounds of movement. No warning signs that matched what I had learned to expect in the woods. The dog kept pulling back harder now. Her whining turned desperate. Her nails scraped at the dirt as she tried to back up without taking her eyes off the trail. Her whole body trembled. I looked ahead again, forcing myself to really look. The trail curved slightly, disappearing behind a wall of brush and tree trunks. Shadows layered on shadows. It was easy to imagine something standing just out of sight, but I couldn't actually see anything. That somehow made it worse. That was when another thought crossed my mind. Uninvited and unwelcome. People. The forest was big, but not untouched. People went missing every year. Sometimes they were found. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes the reason was animals. Sometimes it was other people. Sometimes it was never clear at all. The idea of someone hiding off the trail, watching, waiting, felt more real in that moment than any animal. Animals make noise. Animals move. Animals usually don't sit perfectly still in silence. People can. My wife didn't need to say anything. Her posture had changed too. Shoulders tight, breathing shallow. She was staring the same direction I was, like she expected something to step out at any second. The dog made the decision for us. She pulled hard enough that the leash went tight and dug into my hand. She turned her body sideways and then backward, still trying to keep her head facing forward. She wanted distance. Immediately. That was enough. We turned around. We didn't run at first, but we walked fast. Too fast for comfort on uneven ground. I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I didn't want to see anything there. The dog stayed close to our legs, no longer pulling ahead, no longer sniffing. Her ears stayed pinned back. Every few steps, she glanced behind us, checking the trail we were leaving, as if she expected something to follow. The forest stayed quiet. Too quiet. My senses felt turned up too high. Every sound made my muscles jump. Every shadow between trees looked deeper and darker than it had before. The trail that had felt peaceful minutes earlier now felt narrow and exposed. As we descended, the air seemed to warm. Light filtered in more strongly. Slowly, faint sounds returned. Birds. Wind. Far off, the low roar of the waterfall came back into range. The dog didn't relax until we were well past the climb, back in the wider part of the trail. Even then, she stayed alert, glancing behind us more than ahead. It wasn't until we reached the area near the swimming hole, where people were again visible and voices echoed through the trees, that she finally loosened up. Her tail lifted. Her pace slowed. She stopped pulling altogether. Only then did my own body realize how tense it had been. My hand shook. My jaw ached from being clenched. My heart felt like it had been beating too hard for too long. We didn't hike any farther that day. We didn't sit by the water. We headed straight back to the trailhead and left. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about it, trying to assign a clear reason. A bear would have left signs. Track smell. Sound. A mountain lion would have likely stayed hidden, but the dog's reaction would have been different, more aggressive or alert, not that raw fear. A person made sense in an uncomfortable way, but there was no proof, no evidence, nothing concrete. What stayed with me was the dog. She forgot most things quickly. Squirrels, loud noises, strange places. But weeks later, when we went hiking again in a different area, she hesitated at dense sections of trail. She stayed closer to us than usual. She watched ahead more carefully. That fear had left a mark. I don't know what was ahead of us on that trail. I never will. There was no dramatic reveal, no chase, no proof waiting around the corner. Just a moment where something deeply wrong brushed past our lives and kept going. We trusted the only instinct there was to trust. We turned around, we left, and we went home alive. I worked as a park ranger long enough to learn that the job is mostly quiet work broken up by moments that stick with you forever. People think it is all sunsets and trails and animals. Most days it is paperwork, maintenance, and driving long, empty roads alone. The scary parts do not announce themselves. They slide in quietly and sit in your chest. One afternoon, volunteers from one of my parks called in about a car that was still smoking in a remote campsite. It was not a surprise. Stolen cars got dumped out there all the time. The park was small and out of the way, easy to reach if you knew the roads, and easy to disappear from if you did not want to be found. Cars would get driven in, stripped, burned, and left. It was ugly but normal. I drove out with another ranger, and we could smell it before we saw it. Burned plastic and old gasoline hangs in the air in a way that does not fade quickly. The campsite was empty except for the car. It sat crooked, half on dirt and half on rock. The tires melted into the ground. Thin smoke still rolled out from under the hood and from the open windows. The heat shimmered above it, even though the fire had mostly burned itself out. We stood there waiting for the fire department, just looking at it. It felt casual at first. We pointed out the usual things without speaking much. The plates were gone. The windows were blown out. The interior was blackened. It was the same pattern we had seen before. Then my eyes adjusted and something fell off. The front seat shape did not look right. There was too much left of it. The outline was wrong. I stepped closer and leaned in. The smell changed. It was not just burned car anymore. It was heavy and sour underneath. I could see an arm shape slumped against the door, burned dark and stiff. The head was tilted forward. The body had burned, but not completely. The fire must have gone fast and then died. There was no movement, no sound, just that shape locked into the seat. After that, everything slowed down. We backed away and looked around the site more carefully. The ground was littered with food wrappers, crushed cans, and scraps of rope. The rope was thick and cut clean in places. There were dark marks on the seatbelt. The front seat area looked different from the rest, like someone had been held there. It was clear enough what had happened without needing details. Someone had been tied up and shot, then the car was set on fire. It was clean in a brutal way. Whoever did it had taken their time and then left. The fire department came, then law enforcement. We stepped back and did what we were told. The body was removed. The car was hauled out. The ground was scraped and disturbed and then smoothed again. There were no answers after. No names released to us. No follow-up that meant anything. It became another empty campsite with a story attached to it. People started calling it the haunted site even though none of US believed in that. It was just a name. It became the most popular campsite in that park. People always want the place where something bad happened. They bring their kids, take pictures, laugh too loud, and leave trash behind. I drove past it often, and every time I saw the dark patch where the fire had burned hottest, the ground never looked quite the same. Not long after that, something else happened that settled differently. One of our supervisors in the office got a call from a man threatening to kill himself. He said he had a lot of guns and was done. He gave a location near one of our parks. 2 co-workers were sent out to check it. They drove fast and quiet, knowing what they might be driving into. By the time they arrived, another agency had already found him. They were told to leave before they got pulled into paperwork that would follow them for months. The man had shot himself and not died right away. He tried to walk for help after. The scene was large and cleanup was rough. Blood travels farther than people think. It stains dirt and rock and plants. It does not wash away easily. What stuck with me was the ranger from the other agency who handled it. She had lost her husband the month before. He was also a ranger. He had killed himself, and she had been the one to find him. Then she was the one to find this man too. Some weight cannot be shared or explained. It just sits on someone and stays there. That knowledge made the parks feel smaller and heavier. It made the quiet feel louder. The worst moment for me came later when I was working alone. I had just moved out there and was assigned to 2 parks by myself. Both were closed at the time. They sat far from anything occupied. The nearest houses were about 30 miles away, and even those were usually empty in the summer. The roads were long and empty, and at night they felt endless. One evening, I decided to drive out to the darker park. There was a meteor shower, and I wanted to see it without light around. I also brought my banjo because I was trying to learn. It felt harmless at the time. I parked near a picnic table and sat down under the open sky. The stars were sharp and bright. The desert smelled dry and dusty, with a hint of creosote from the bushes around me. I started plucking strings badly. The sound felt small in the open space. It disappeared fast. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of how alone I was. The park had no lights, no traffic noise, no distant hum. Just wind and the scrape of my fingers on metal strings. My thoughts started to spiral in a way they do when there is nothing to interrupt them. The burned car site was not far from where I sat. I knew exactly how to get there, even in the dark. My mind went there without effort. I imagined the smoke again, the smell, the shape in the seat. I imagined someone pulling into the park without lights. I imagined being watched from the brush. The silence felt thick, like it was pressing in. I kept playing, trying to focus on the simple motion of my hands. Then I heard something else. At first it was faint and uneven. Soft sounds moving through the bushes. Leaves brushing against each other. Something low and muffled underneath it. My heart rate jumped fast and hard. The back of my neck went cold. My body knew something before my mind caught up. The sounds moved closer. They were quick and light, not heavy footsteps. There was a strange pitch to them that did not fit anything I expected. My eyes strained to make shapes out of the dark. Every bush looked like it was leaning in. The sounds came in bursts, then stopped, then came again. My hands froze on the strings. The banjo rested heavy in my lap. For a few seconds, I was sure this was going to be bad. Not dramatic bad, just quietly bad. The kind of bad that ends with a report and a cleanup and a memory that lives on in someone else. I stood up slowly and listened harder. The sounds broke loose suddenly. 3 shapes burst through the creosote bushes and ran past me close enough that I felt air move. Coyotes. Thin, fast, and careless. They made sharp yips and strange high noises as they ran. Full of energy and not concerned with me at all. They disappeared into the dark as quickly as they had appeared. The desert swallowed them again and went still. I stood there for a long time after, letting my heart slow down. The banjo felt stupid in my hands. The night felt different now. Not peaceful, just indifferent. The meteors still streaked overhead, silent and distant. I packed up, got in my car, and drove back down the long road without stopping. Nothing supernatural happened to me out there. No ghosts, no signs, no answers. Just people doing terrible things to themselves and others, and animals living their lives without caring who hears them. That night made things clear for me. The parks were not haunted. They were just places where the quiet made reality harder to ignore. I never played the banjo there again. I remember that hike in the Adirondacks as a slow build of bad timing and bad feelings that stacked up until my body just broke. It was early spring, the kind of early spring that tricks you into thinking winter is done when it really is not. The snow was mostly gone, but the ground was soaked and soft. The air smelled like rot and cold water. Leaves from last fall were still plastered to the trail like wet paper. We had picked a loop trail that went around a lake, one way in and one way out because it felt safer than something deep and remote. The trailhead sign looked old and faded. There were no other cars in the lot when we pulled in, which should have been a warning, but at the time felt peaceful. The day before had already wrecked me. I had spent hours vomiting from something bad I ate, been over in a tiny bathroom, shaking and sweating. I barely slept. My stomach still felt hollow and sour, like it was bruised. I told myself that walking would help, that fresh air would reset me. That is what people always say. The Adirondacks had been our vacation spot again and again, and I had gone along with it even though I was tired of forests and damp cabins and muddy boots. I wanted pavement and cafes and places with doors that locked. The trail started narrow and dark, hugging the lake. The water was flat and black, broken only by dead reeds sticking up like ribs. Every step made a soft sucking sound. Fallen branches were everywhere, some snapped clean, others bent and twisted like someone had stepped on them recently. Trail cleanup had not started yet, so it felt messy and forgotten. The forest pressed in close. Pines mixed with bare hardwoods, their branches clicking together in the breeze. I kept pulling my jacket tighter, even though I was already sweating. We were hiking toward a small waterfall that the map marked with a blue line and a star. About halfway around the loop, the trail narrowed even more. The ground dipped and rose, and the lake fell away behind us. The air felt heavier there, damp and still. My legs felt weak from the day before, and my breathing was shallow. Every sound felt too loud. My boots squelched. Somewhere far off, something cracked, maybe a tree shifting or ice breaking. I try not to let my mind run. That was when I heard it. At first, it was just a low rumble, like heavy footsteps pounding the ground. It felt close, not echoing, not distant. The sound moved fast, like something charging straight toward us through brush. My chest tightened instantly. My body reacted before my brain could do anything useful. Then the sound changed. It rose up into this harsh, mechanical growl that sped up and got louder in seconds. It did not sound like any animal I knew. It sounded wrong. It sounded like what movies use when they want you to feel unsafe, like something big and angry and not natural. Fear hit me so hard it was physical. My hands went numb. My vision tunneled. I turned and ran without thinking, without checking the trail, without caring about anything except getting away. My boots slipped on wet leaves. Branches whipped my legs. My breath burned. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The growl kept going for a moment, then stopped, which somehow made it worse. Silence felt like waiting. I ran until my lungs felt like they were tearing. When I finally stopped, I bent over, gasping, hands on my knees. My stomach cramped, still weak from the day before. I felt dizzy and lightheaded. I could not make myself turn back toward the sound. Every nerve in my body screamed not to. The trail behind me looked darker now, like it had closed in. I knew the logical thing was to keep moving forward to finish the loop, but panic does not care about logic. The idea of going back the way we came filled me with dread. The thought of that narrow trail and the tight trees and that sound coming again made my throat close. Instead, I looked off to the side, toward the low, open area that the map had marked as wetland. It looked awful. Brown water, thick grass, mud that swallowed footprints. But it led toward the far side of the loop, and eventually the exit. It felt like the lesser evil. We pushed through the bog slowly. Each step was a fight. The mud grabbed at my boots and tried to pull them off. Water soaked in around my ankles. The ground shifted under my weight, unstable and alive in the worst way. My legs shook with effort. My breathing stayed fast and shallow. Every splash sounded too showy. like it was calling attention to us. I kept expecting that sound to start again, closer this time, right behind me. The bog smelled like decay and old water. Insects buzzed low to the ground. My calves burned. My mind kept replaying the noise, trying to match it to something known and failing every time. Bear felt too obvious, too heavy. Moose felt wrong, too quiet usually. The sound had been fast and sharp and angry. My imagination filled in shapes I did not want to see. When we finally reached firmer ground, my legs nearly gave out with relief. Trees thinned, and the trail reappeared, clearer and wider. I could see light through the branches ahead. The lake came back into view, calm and empty. No sounds chased us. No footsteps followed. Still, I did not relax. Fear lingers even when danger does not. The walk back to the trailhead felt endless. Every snapped twig made me flinch. Every shadow looked like movement. My mouth tasted sour. My head pounded. When the parking lot finally appeared through the trees, it felt unreal, like stepping out of a bad dream. The car sat alone where we left it, dusty and ordinary. I unlocked it with shaking hands and climbed inside, closing the door hard behind me. Once I was in the car, the fear spilled out. My chest hitched. Tears came fast and hot. My whole body trembled. I felt embarrassed by how wrecked I was, but I could not stop it. I felt worn down by the hike, by the sickness from the day before, by the years of choosing forests when I wanted streets. The Adirondacks had finally beaten me. Sitting there, staring out at the quiet trees, I promised myself that the next vacation would be different, that I would choose a place with crowds and noise and no mystery sounds in the woods. Time passed. Life moved on. That relationship ended for reasons that had nothing to do with that hike and everything to do with who we were becoming. The memory of the sound faded into a blur of fear and adrenaline. It became a story I told myself about why I did not belong deep in the woods. I avoided remote trails. I stuck to parks with maps and cell service. I told myself I was fine with that. Years later, on a quiet evening at home, I was half listening to a video of nature sounds while doing something else. It was background noise, meant to be calming. Birds, wind, water. Then I heard it. That same sound. The low thump that built into a rapid, grinding growl. My body reacted instantly, just like before. A chill ran straight up my spine, sharp and electric. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. It took a second for my brain to catch up and remind me that I was safe, sitting in a chair, nowhere near a bog or a lake. I stopped the video and replayed it, forcing myself to listen. The sound was labeled this time. It was not a monster or a bear or anything out of a nightmare. It was a rough grouse, a male standing alone in the woods, beating its wings against its chest to make that noise as a mating call. A horny bird, puffed up and loud, trying to impress something that probably was not even there. Learning that did not erase the fear, but it changed it. The sound that had sent me running through mud and panic was real, natural, and common. I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, already sick and exhausted, with my nerves stripped raw. My body had done what bodies do when they think something is about to hurt them. The Adirondacks had not been trying to scare me. They had just been themselves. The ending of that memory is clear to me now. I did not escape a monster. I escaped my own fear, fueled by bad timing and a loud bird doing what birds have done forever. Knowing that does not mean I want to go back to that trail. Some places keep their power over you even after you understand them. But the mystery is gone, and in its place is something smaller and almost funny, a reminder of how thin the line is between calm and terror when you are alone in the woods and your body decides before your mind ever gets a say. I worked as a tree planter in northern Ontario, the kind of job you only really understand once you've done it. You live out of tent for months at a time, eat when you can, sleep when your body finally gives up, and spend every daylight hour bent forward with a shovel, cutting lines in a land most people will never see. We were dropped off by trucks that drove for hours down logging roads that barely counted as roads. By the time the engines shut off, there was nothing around us but forest in every direction. No trails, no campsites, no lakes with docks or fire pits. just trees stacked so tight they swallowed sound. Our camp was a cluster of tents in a clearing hacked out by machines years earlier. The ground was hard, full of roots and rocks. Everything smelled like wet earth, sap, fuel, and sweat. Nights were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. There were no distant highway, sounds, no planes overhead, nothing human at all once the generators shut down. You could hear your own breathing inside the tent, the fabric snapping when the wind shifted, and sometimes something large moving far off in the bush. Most days blurred together. Wake up sore. Pull on damp clothes. Walk or get driven out to your block. Plant until your hands cramped and your legs shook. Count trees. Drink water that tasted faintly of plastic and iodine. The work itself was brutal but simple, and that simplicity let your mind wander into places it probably shouldn't. Out there, you were always aware of how small you were. One wrong step, one injury, and you were hours away from help if help could even get to you. The first thing that really got under my skin wasn't something that happened to me. It was something a guy from another crew brought back to camp one evening. He had found a backpack while planting his piece. Not near a road, not near water, just sitting on the ground between rows of black spruce, like it had been set down and forgotten. Inside were shoes, clothes, a wallet with a school ID, and an old film camera. No rot, no mold, no animal damage. It hadn't been there long, or at least it hadn't been there long enough to look like it belonged to the forest. That area was not a place anyone would hike. There were no views, no landmarks, no reason to be there unless you were working. The logging roads were miles away, and even those weren't marked on most maps. Seeing something so normal, so human, sitting in that much emptiness felt wrong. Like finding a kitchen chair in the middle of the ocean. The stuff didn't belong, and the fact that it was there meant someone had been too. Someone who hadn't come back for it. After that, I started noticing how often the forest reminded you that you were not welcome. I woke up one night to the sound of fabric tearing. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow rip like someone pulling cloth apart carefully. I didn't fully wake up. I rolled over, half dreaming, and went back under. In the morning, I found my tent vestibule collapsed inward. One side pole bent down, the fabric shredded open in a long, curved tier. There were clear claw marks, wide and deep, the kind you don't need to measure to know what made them. A bear had been right there, close enough that if it had pushed a little harder, it would have been inside with me. I had slept through all of it. That realization hit harder than fear at first. It was embarrassment mixed with shock. I had always told myself I would wake up, that I would hear danger coming. But I hadn't. My body had trusted the thin layer of nylon between me and the forest had tested that trust without waking me. The thought that something that big and that strong could touch my shelter, tear it open, and leave without me knowing made sleep feel different after that. Every night, I lay there listening, imagining how close I really was to whatever moved outside. Another day, while planting alone, I turned a corner around a dense stand of young trees and found myself face to face with a wolf. It was less than 10 feet away. Big, gray, solid. Not skinny, not scared. We both froze. I remember noticing the thickness of its neck, the way its chest rose and fell slowly, the yellow in its eyes that didn't look wild or frantic, just alert. It felt like time stretched thin, like the air itself had weight. Then it stepped back, quiet as smoke, and disappeared into the trees. My legs shook for a long time after that. Wolves don't usually bother people. I knew that. But knowledge doesn't matter much when you are suddenly reminded that you are made of meat and bone and nothing else. That wolf had been living there its whole life. I was the strange thing in its world, walking in straight lines and poking holes in the ground. The moment that stayed with me, the most happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had been working my way across a slope, planting steadily, focused on my rhythm. Step, dig, plant, step, dig, plant. I finished my piece and walked back along the same line to check my spacing. The soil was still soft where I had stepped minutes earlier. Then I saw the tracks. Fresh bear prints. Big ones, deep in the mud, alongside smaller ones that wobbled slightly. A mother and her cubs had walked right through the spot where I had been planting. Not hours before. Minutes. They had passed behind me while my back was turned. I stood there, suddenly very aware of how quiet everything was. Bears with cubs are not something you want to surprise. They don't bluff much. They don't need to. The idea that I had been so close, so unaware, made my skin crawl. I slowly backed out of that area, heart pounding, every snapped twig sounding like a warning. As the season went on, these moments stacked up. The torn tent, the wolf, the tracks, the strange backpack that no one could explain. The way the forest closed in when the light dropped, turning familiar ground into something unknown. I started to understand that fear out there wasn't about monsters or imagination. It was about reality. It was about how thin the line was between a normal day and something going very wrong. By the time planting ended, I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscles. When we finally packed up camp and the trucks came back, the sound of engines felt unreal. As we drove out, passing endless trees through dusty windows, I kept thinking about how that forest would go on exactly the same once we were gone. Our tents would leave no trace. Our footsteps would fade. Whatever had ripped my tent and watched me plant would still be there, moving through the same spaces, living by rules that had nothing to do with us. When we hit pavement hours later, the world felt louder and smaller. Buildings, signs, people. I was relieved to be back, but something had shifted. I had seen how close danger could be without making a sound. I had learned that in places like that, nothing dramatic needs to happen for things to be terrifying. You don't need ghosts or legends. You just need to realize how little protection you really have when you step into a world that does not care if you exist at all. I went out there without a plan because I did not care much about what happened to me that day. I had been sleeping badly for weeks. My head felt heavy all the time, like it was full of wet sand. I wanted distance from my car, my phone, my apartment, and the mess I had just crawled out of with my ex. The mountains in Colorado had always felt honest to me. They did not pretend to care. They were just there, solid and old. And I thought maybe being around something that did not care would quiet my own head for a while. I parked along a rough pullout that barely counted as one. There was packed snow on the ground, but it had started to soften under the sun. The air was cold enough to sting my nose when I breathed in, but not cold enough to feel clean. I grabbed my pack and started walking without checking a map. I knew I was stepping off trail early, but I wanted that. I wanted to feel like I was disappearing into something bigger. The forest was quiet in the way that feels heavy, not peaceful. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my boots crunching through old snow and ice. I kept my hood down even though it was cold because I wanted to hear everything. The ground sloped upward, slow at first, then steeper. My legs burned, which felt good because it was something real I could point to. About an hour in, I reached a shallow stream cutting across my path. The water was narrow but fast, clear enough to see stones on the bottom. Ice covered parts of it in thin sheets that looked solid from a distance. I stepped onto what I thought was stable ground, and my foot shot out from under me. I went down hard, landing on my side and sliding straight into the water. The shock of the cold punched the air out of my lungs. My pack soaked through on one side, and my pants were wet from the knee down. I sat there for a moment in the stream, half submerged, feeling stupid and tired. Getting back up felt like too much effort. Going back to the car felt even worse. I stood eventually, water dripping from me, and kept going uphill instead of turning around. It felt like crossing some small line. I was wet, cold, and alone off trail, and instead of fixing it, I leaned into it. The slope got steeper and rockier. Trees thinned out in places, opening into patches of scrub and exposed stone. Snow collected in pockets where the sun could not reach. I slowed down, watching my footing. That was when I saw the bone. It was pale against the dark ground, long and smooth, lying half buried in snow near a cluster of rocks. At first it did not register as anything serious. It looked old and clean, like something that had been there a long time. I stepped closer out of curiosity. That was when my brain caught up and my stomach tightened. A few feet away, scattered between two low mounds of earth and brush, were more bones. Several long limb bones, smaller fragments, and a section of spine stretched out in a rough line. The vertebrae were still linked together, curved in a way that suggested how the body had once been laid out. There was no hide, no fur, no blood. Everything was bleached by weather and sun. It had been picked clean. I stood there longer than I should have. The air felt thicker, like it was pressing in on me. I became aware of how quiet everything was. I scanned the trees, the rocks, the slope above me. There were no fresh tracks that I could see, but the snow was old and crusted. Whatever had left those bones did not need to leave signs today. The bones were not human. I knew that quickly, but that did not make me feel better. They were too large, too long. Elk, maybe. Something big enough to feed a large predator for days. The place where they lay felt wrong, like a feeding site, like a spot something returned to. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures, my hands clumsy in the cold. I do not know why I did it. Maybe I wanted proof that I had seen it, or proof later that I was not overreacting. My heart beat harder the longer I stood there. The thought of being watched crept in slow and sticky. I had not heard anything, but that almost made it worse. I started backing downhill, slow and careful, keeping my eyes moving. Every shadow between trees looked like it could hold something heavy and patient. My wet clothes cooled fast as soon as I stopped moving uphill. Halfway down, I paused. The silence still held. Nothing rushed me. Nothing showed itself. That was when doubt crept in. I told myself it was just old bones, that predators were always around whether I noticed them or not. Going back to my car meant sitting alone with my thoughts again, replaying things I did not want to replay. The mountain felt more honest than that. I turned back uphill. I took maybe 5 steps before the sound reached me. It was not loud, just the unmistakable noise of something moving with weight. A slow shift of ground, a scrape of stone. Not frantic, not hiding. Something comfortable moving where it belonged. My body reacted before my mind did. The tightness in my chest snapped into full panic. Every instinct screamed that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did not look for what made the sound. I did not want to know. I turned and went downhill fast, faster than was smart. My boots slipped on the icy patches. My legs shook from adrenaline. The forest seemed steeper now, the ground less forgiving. I focused on staying upright, on not falling again. The thought of being on the ground, slow and exposed, filled me with a sharp fear that cut through everything else. When I reached the stream again, I crossed without stopping, misjudged my step, and went down a second time. Cold water rushed over my ankle and calf. I swore under my breath as I scrambled back up, soaking myself even more. I did not stop to catch my breath. I climbed the far bank and kept moving. I did not hear anything chasing me. That did not calm me. Predators do not always chase. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they follow at a distance, curious, deciding. I forced myself to keep a steady pace instead of running blindly. My ears strained for any sound behind me, any change in the rhythm of the forest. The walk back felt longer than the hike in. My wet clothes rubbed my skin raw. My pack pulled heavy on my shoulders. Every few minutes I glanced back, expecting to see movement, a shape slipping between trees. I never did. The forest stayed closed and quiet, giving nothing away. Eventually the slope eased, and I recognized the rough outline of the pullout through the trees. Relief came in a wave so strong it made my knees weak. I stepped out of the forest and onto the packed dirt near my car, the open space suddenly feeling exposed instead of safe. I stripped off my wet layers beside the car, hands shaking as much from leftover fear as from cold. Sitting in the driver's seat with the door closed felt unreal, like I was sealing myself off from something that had almost noticed me. I stayed there for a long time before starting the engine, breathing slowly until my heart settled. On the drive home, the images replayed without warning. The clean bones, the linked spine, the sound of weight shifting above me. I knew what lived in those mountains. I knew how close I had likely been to something that could have ended me without effort if things had gone differently. What stayed with me most was how small the moment had been. No chase, no attack, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet reminder that I had stepped into a place where I was not important, not special, and not safe. I went out there to escape my own head, and instead I was forced back into my body, into the simple need to stay alive. I never went back to that area. I still hike, still wander, but I pay attention now. I stay on trails. I listen when the forest goes quiet. That day did not fix my depression or change my life in any clean way. It did something simpler. It showed me how thin the line is between being alone on purpose and being alone in the worst possible way, and how fast that line can disappear under your feet. We went out there thinking it would be an easy, quiet day. Nothing special, just a long hike to burn some energy and let the dog run a little. It was a state park on the East Coast, thick woods, rolling hills, the kind of place that feels old without trying to be dramatic about it. The kind of place where the trees are tall and close together, and the ground is always damp even if it hasn't rained in days. It was the middle of the week, late morning moving into early afternoon. Most people were at work. The parking lot only had a few cars when we pulled in. That alone already set the tone. Usually, parks like that have a steady flow of people, even on weekdays. Joggers, retirees, someone walking a stroller. That day felt empty in a way that stuck out, but didn't seem wrong yet. We started down one of the longer loop trails. The air was cool, but not cold, with that smell of wet leaves and dirt. Sunlight filtered through the trees in broken patches. Everything sounded normal. Our boots on gravel and dirt. Our dog moving ahead, sniffing everything. Birds calling from somewhere high up. Occasionally the rustle of something small moving through brush. For the first hour or so, it stayed like that. We passed 2 people total, both times just quick nods while everyone kept moving. After that, it felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. The trail narrowed in places, widened in others, and dipped into sections where the trees pressed in closer and blocked most of the light. It wasn't scary. It was just quiet. The dog stayed relaxed, trotting ahead and circling back, tail loose. He was used to hiking. He had been in woods plenty of times. Nothing about his behavior gave me any reason to feel uneasy. The first time I noticed the sound, it barely registered. It was faint and distant, almost like wind moving through something hollow. I remember thinking it sounded strange, but I didn't stop walking. I kept going, assuming it would fade or turn into something recognizable. Sometimes sound carries weird in the woods. Voices bounce. Birds echo. You hear things that aren't really there. But it didn't go away. As we kept walking, the sound became more steady. It wasn't loud yet, just consistent. A low, rhythmic tone, rising and falling in a slow pattern. That was when I realized it didn't match anything natural around us. It didn't sound like wind, or animals, or machinery. It sounded organized, intentional. I became aware of my own breathing and footsteps in a way I hadn't been before. The woods felt suddenly too quiet except for that sound. The birds had stopped calling. Even the insects seemed muted. I glanced at the dog and noticed his ears were straight up. His body was stiff in a way I had never seen on a hike before. He wasn't barking or growling. He wasn't pulling. He was just alert, fully focused on something ahead and slightly off to one side. The chanting became clearer with every step. There was no mistaking it anymore. It sounded like multiple voices layered together, deep and steady, following a slow rhythm. It reminded me of recordings of monks chanting in old stone buildings. The sound felt full, like it had weight to it, like it was filling the air instead of just passing through it. What made it worse was how close it sounded. Not distant, not echoing from far away. It felt like it was right there, just out of sight, as if we were walking alongside it without seeing the source. The volume stayed the same, no matter how much ground we covered. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. I tried to calm myself by thinking logically. This was a public park, middle of the day. No reason for anything truly dangerous or strange. I told myself it had to be people. Maybe a group messing around. Maybe someone playing music or chanting as a joke. Teenagers or college kids doing something dumb for a video. But the deeper we went, the less that explanation made sense. There were no side trails in that stretch. No signs of campsites. No clearings. Just dense woods on both sides and a single trail cutting through it. The chanting grew louder, fuller, until it felt like it was surrounding us. It didn't come from one direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the sound was bouncing between the trees and wrapping around us. My chest felt tight. I remember noticing my hands had clenched in a fist without me realizing it. The dog slowed down and stayed closer to us. His hair stood up along his back, a clear ridge from his shoulders down to his tail. He kept stopping, sniffing the air, then moving again, clearly unsure but unwilling to bolt. The sound stayed steady for several minutes, long enough that it stopped feeling surprising and started feeling wrong. I remember thinking that if it were people, we should have seen something by then. A flash of color through the trees. Movement. Anything. Instead, there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and that chanting that felt too clean and too clear to be coming from somewhere hidden. Then just like that, it stopped. No fading. No trailing off. One moment it was there, loud and constant, and the next moment it was completely gone. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound itself. It pressed in on my ears. I could hear my own heartbeat. The dog froze in place for a second, then slowly relaxed, though he didn't go back to his normal behavior. We kept walking. Turning around didn't feel like an option. Stopping didn't feel safe either. The trail ahead was the only thing that made sense. The woods looked exactly the same as before, but everything felt different. Every shadow looked deeper. Every sound made me tense. The rest of the hike passed in a strange, stretched-out way. Time felt slow. The dog stayed close, never moving far ahead. The woods never brought the chanting back, but the absence of it almost felt worse. Like whatever had made that sound had chosen to stop, not because it had ended, but because it wanted to. As we got closer to the trailhead, normal sounds slowly returned. Birds started calling again. We heard distant road noise. The tension eased a little, but it didn't fully leave. When the parking lot finally came into view, it felt like stepping out of a different place entirely. We drove home in silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where you don't want to break it, because speaking might make things feel real. The dog curled up in the back seat and fell asleep almost immediately, like his body had been running on pure adrenaline out there. Later that evening, I looked up the park online. I read through visitor reviews and old forum posts. Buried in the comments were a few mentions of strange sounds carrying through certain sections of the woods. People described hearing chanting, singing, or humming. Most explanations pointed to sound traveling from a distant monastery several miles away when the conditions were right. Temperature, humidity, wind direction. The forest acting like a funnel. That explanation made sense on paper. Sound can travel farther than people realize. Woods can distort direction and distance. The brain fills in gaps when it can't see the source. But even knowing that, it doesn't fully sit right with me. The monastery, according to maps, was far enough away that we shouldn't have heard it that clearly. Not like that. Not loud enough to feel like it was next to us. Not with no change in volume as we walked. I've hiked plenty of times since then. In bigger parks. In deeper woods. I've heard animals scream, trees crack, wind howl through valleys. None of it has felt the same. That day didn't feel like something supernatural. It felt like something physical, real, and explainable, but still wrong in a way that logic doesn't fully cover. Like standing too close to heavy machinery you can't see. Like being near something powerful that doesn't care you're there. We never went back to that trail. Not because we think something lives there, or because we believe in anything mystical. We just know what it felt like to be in that moment, hearing something we couldn't see, something that knew exactly how to carry itself through the woods. And sometimes, when everything is quiet at night, I still remember how clear that sound was and how empty the forest felt once it stopped. I was in Big Bend National Park a little over 20 years ago, down in the far western edge of Texas where the land drops and bends with the Rio Grande. I was there to prep material for a backpacking presentation I was putting together for REI. Back then I took those kind of talks seriously. I wanted my photos to feel earned, not pulled off a brochure or borrowed from someone else's trip. Big Bend was perfect for that. It was wide open, quiet, and honest. High desert that smelled like dust and creosote, broken up by low mountains and deep cuts where water had once mattered more than it did now. That afternoon, I was hiking near Santa Elena Canyon. The canyon walls there rise straight up, pale and sheer, and then suddenly the land opens out into a flatter basin where the river spreads and slows. That area always felt different to me, like a natural funnel where animals moved through without caring much about human schedules. I wanted pictures of that transition zone. I remember checking the light and realizing I had maybe 2 hours before sunset. Enough time to wander, but not enough to get careless. My van was parked several hundred meters away in what passed for a trailhead lot at the time. It wasn't much, just packed dirt and a sign that had been sun bleached for years. I wasn't worried about distance. I was more focused on angles and shadows, on how the canyon mouth framed the basin. The air was still. No wind. Every sound carried farther than you'd expect. As I moved closer to the river basin, something caught my eye across the water. At first it didn't make sense. There was movement, slow and deliberate, but it didn't match any shape my brain could quickly label. It was big, roughly the size of a person, but low to the ground. The color blended into the desert tones, that muted brown-gray you see on deer and dry grass. It was moving in a strange way, almost like it was sliding. For a few seconds my mind tried to force it into something familiar. It looked like a medium-sized, white-tailed doe lying on its side and somehow pushing itself along like a snake. The thought didn't last long because it was ridiculous. Animals don't move like that unless something is very wrong. I took a few slow steps to my left to get a better angle, careful not to make noise, not because I felt threatened yet, but because curiosity had me locked in. The shape resolved all at once, like a photo snapping into focus. It was a mountain lion, a full-grown one, bigger than I expected, longer than I expected, its body stretched low and tight to the ground. The way it moved was efficient, almost lazy, every muscle doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing more. It wasn't wandering. It was hunting. I had never seen one in the wild before. I knew they were there, of course. Everyone who spends time in Big Bend knows that. Knowing and seeing are different things. When my brain finally accepted what my eyes were telling it, I felt a cold wash move through my chest and down my arms. My heart didn't race right away. It slowed, heavy and deliberate, like it was bracing. The lion was focused on something I couldn't see, probably just on my side of the river or not far from it. Its head came up and turned toward me. That moment is burned into my memory in a way few others are. The eyes locked on me, and there was a visible shift. Not surprise, not fear. Calculation. I could almost feel it measuring distance, effort, risk. I've heard people talk about prey animals freezing when a predator looks at them, and I understood it then in a very personal way. I have never been so grateful for a strip of water in my life. The Rio Grande at that point was low. Drought had been hammering the region, and upstream water use had taken its toll. You could probably have crossed it in places without much trouble, but it was still wide, and to an animal like that, water is never just water. It's uncertainty, slippery footing, noise, lost traction. The lion did these quick double takes, its head shifting from me to wherever its original target had been and back again. It wasn't frantic. It was thoughtful. That somehow made it worse. I stood where I was, squared up, not turning my back, my hands low and still. I started to move away, inch by inch, slow enough that it felt unreal. My boots barely disturbed the gravel. Time stretched in a strange way. Every second felt thick. I was aware of my breathing, shallow and controlled, of sweat forming along my spine, even though the air was cooling. I remember thinking how exposed I was, how small the human frame really is without tools or distance on its side. At some point, the lion's attention drifted fully away from me. Maybe I wasn't worth the energy. Maybe the river complicated things too much. Maybe its original hunt mattered more. I didn't wait to analyze it. Once I broke line of sight, once the curve of the land and the low brush took it out of view, I kept moving, still controlled but faster now. Every step aimed toward that van like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The walk back felt endless even though it wasn't. I checked behind me more times than I can count without turning fully around. When I finally reached the van and got inside, I shut the door softly and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling my pulse in my ears. It took a long time before my heart rate settled into something normal. That wasn't the end of the day. That night, I parked off the main park road in an area known for big cat activity. I did it because it was legal, because I was tired, and because I didn't want to drive any farther in the dark. I ate slightly stale Oreos and drank warm water, sitting there in the quiet. The desert at night is never silent. It breathes. Every so often, from somewhere out there beyond the reach of the headlights, I heard it. A low growl, then later a scream, raw and sharp, cutting through the darkness. Inside the van, I felt both safe and completely aware of how thin that safety was. Metal and glass. A lock. I was high enough on the food chain to have tools and shelter, and low enough to still matter to something that hunted for a living. That thought stayed with me. A few days later, after picking up a respiratory illness from too many cold mornings and dusty hikes, I took NyQuil, knowing full well that it sometimes messed with my head. That night, I hallucinated vivid and physical shapes and sounds folding into one another. I woke up screaming, heart pounding, convinced for a few seconds that something was inside the van with me. It took longer than I like to admit to realize where I was and that I was alone. I finished the trip. I gave the presentation. I showed the pictures. People asked about gear and routes and weather. I answered all of it. What I didn't talk about much was that moment by the river, or the sounds in the dark, or how thin the line really is between observer and participant out there. I left Big Bend with a deeper respect for the place and for the things that live there year-round. I drove away knowing that nothing supernatural had happened, nothing mystical. Just a reminder, clear and sharp, that I had stepped briefly into someone else's hunting ground and been allowed to leave. I'm not a ranger, just someone who likes long trails and quiet places. About 8 years ago, I was hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. I do not remember the exact stretch, but I remember the feel of it clearly. Thick woods, rolling ground, damp soil, and that steady green wall that seems to lean in on you the deeper you go. The trail that day was in good shape. White blazes showed up exactly when they were supposed to. The weather was mild, a little cool, with that soft Appalachian humidity that never fully leaves your skin. I was hiking with a small group. Nothing organized or official, just people who wanted to cover miles together. Like always, the group spread out naturally. Faster people drifted ahead. Slower people lagged back. It was not careless, just how hiking works. You can still hear each other now, and then boots on dirt, a cough, a pack shifting. I was in the middle cluster, 4 of us within sight of each other most of the time. At some point, one person stopped to deal with the tick. The other stayed with them, which was smart. I felt fine moving ahead a bit. The Appalachian Trail is one of the best marked trails in the country. You see those white blazes so often that they almost become background noise. I knew the next landmark was an old logging road. It was marked on the map and mentioned in the guide. I figured I would reach it, wait there, and everyone would catch up in a few minutes. I moved at a steady pace, not rushing, just enjoying the quiet and the rhythm of walking. The woods were alive the way they usually are. Birds calling back and forth, insects buzzing low, leaves shifting in the breeze. The ground was uneven but familiar. Rocks, roots, packed dirt. Nothing unusual. About half a mile later, I came to the logging road. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. An old cut running across the trail, mostly grown back in, but still clearly a road. Grass and weeds in the middle, tire ruts softened by years of rain and leaves. Trees had leaned back in from both sides, but the space was still open compared to the trail. I stopped there, dropped my pack, and took a drink of water. I figured I had time to kill. The others would show up soon enough. While waiting, I wandered a short distance down the logging road. It ran perpendicular to the trail, cutting off into the woods. I did not go far, just a casual walk. There was a low stone wall along one side, the kind you see all over the Appalachians, built long ago by people clearing land that eventually went back to forest. Moss covered most of it. Some stones had fallen, others were still stacked neatly. I followed the wall, stepping slow, looking at the ground and the stones, half hoping to see something old and interesting. A bottle, a tool, anything with a story. I was relaxed. There was no sense of danger at all at first. Then it happened all at once. One step was normal. The next step was wrong. It felt like I crossed an invisible line. The change was instant and complete. All sound cut out. Not faded. Not slowly died down. It stopped. Birds that had been calling seconds before were gone. Insects vanished. Even the leaves stopped moving. The woods went dead silent in a way I had never experienced before. The silence itself was loud. It pressed in on my ears. I could hear my own breathing and the soft scrape of my boot, and that was it. No wind. No life noise. Just me. I slowed down without thinking and took another careful step. The air felt different. Heavier somehow. The hair on my arms started to rise. I did not know why yet, but my body already knew something was wrong. I took another step and then another, and with each one the feeling grew stronger. It was not fear at first. It was rejection. That is the only word that fits. It felt like I had walked into a place where I did not belong, where something else was already there and did not want me. The feeling wrapped around my chest and stomach and tightened. My skin prickled from head to toe. I stopped moving. The urge to leave was immediate and overwhelming. It was not a thought. It was a command coming from somewhere deep and old. Every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to get out of that spot right now. Not soon. Not after one more look. Right now. I looked down the road ahead of me. There was nothing obvious. Trees. Shadows. The road curving slightly. No movement. No sound. No shape that I could point to and say that is the problem. That somehow made it worse. The feeling was so strong that I did not want to turn my back. I did not want to move in any way that showed weakness. My heart was beating hard, but my body was locked tight, trying to stay quiet. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The group was out of sight. The trail was behind me. I was standing on an old road that no one used anymore, surrounded by thick woods that could hide anything. I decided to back out. I moved 1 foot slowly backward, placing it down as gently as I could. I did not take my eyes off the road ahead. I did not blink if I could help it. I felt exposed, like something was watching from just out of view, waiting for the moment I turned around. Step by step I backed up. Each movement felt wrong, like making noise in a quiet room where someone is trying to sleep. The silence held the whole time. The feeling stayed just as strong, pushing me away. Then just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. My heel crossed that invisible line and the world turned back on. Birds called again. Leaves rustled. The woods breathed. The pressure lifted off my chest like a hand letting go. I stopped and stood there, shaking slightly, trying to calm my breathing. The logging road looked normal again. Just an overgrown path and an old stone wall. No signs of anything unusual. I did not go back down the road. I returned to the trail and waited. When the rest of the group showed up, we kept moving. I did not mention what happened. I did not want to put the feeling into words while it was still fresh. I wanted distance from it, both in space and in my head. The rest of the hike passed without incident. Miles went by. The woods went back to being just woods. Sounds stayed where they belonged. Nothing else strange happened. Years later, I still think about that moment. I do not frame it as anything supernatural. I do not believe I crossed into some cursed space or anything like that. The more time that passed, the clearer the explanation became. West Virginia has predators. Black bears for sure. And at the time there were still occasional reports of large cats moving through from other regions. Predators know how to be quiet. They know how to freeze the woods. When something big and alert is nearby, birds stop calling. Small animals go still. The forest holds its breath. What I felt was my body noticing something my eyes could not see yet. A bear bedded down just off the road. A large animal watching, deciding whether I mattered. I likely walked straight into its awareness zone, close enough that it knew exactly where I was. The silence makes sense. The wall of feeling makes sense. That intense sense of being unwelcome makes sense when you think about entering the space of a wild animal that does not want to be surprised or challenged. What sticks with me is how fast it all happened and how clear the message was. There was no confusion, no debate. My instincts took over completely and without hesitation. They kept me from doing the stupid human thing of wandering forward out of curiosity. I did not see the animal. I did not hear it. That is part of why it stays with me. Whatever was there was good at staying hidden, and it let me know I was too close without ever showing itself. That day taught me something I never forgot. The woods do not need to look scary to be dangerous. Sometimes the warning comes as a feeling instead of a sight or sound. When that happens, the smartest thing you can do is listen, back away, and leave. I did, and I walked out of those woods safe, with nothing but a memory and a deep respect for how alive and aware the forest really is. I was working at a remote mountaintop microwave radio site outside Prince Rupert in January, the kind of place that only exists because radio waves need high ground and nobody ever thinks about what it takes to keep those links alive in winter. The site sat above the tree line, surrounded by nothing but snow, rock, and wind. The road that normally snaked up the mountain was completely buried. Even the snowcat could not make it through the drifts anymore. The only way in or out was by helicopter, one drop in the morning and one pickup at the end of the day, weather allowing. Once the helicopter left, the silence settled in hard and fast, like a door closing on the rest of the world. The building itself was small and plain, maybe 30 by 40 feet, single story, poured concrete walls, no windows at all. It was designed that way on purpose, to keep the weather and curious animals out, and to keep the equipment stable. A metal front door faced downhill toward a clearing where the helicopter landed. The rest of the building was surrounded by snowbanks that reached up almost to the roof in places. Inside, it smelled like cold metal, dust, and old insulation. The hum of the racks and the steady whine of the equipment were the only constant sounds once you shut the door. That morning had been gray and heavy. Low clouds hung over the mountain, and everything felt muffled. The helicopter dropped me off, unloaded my gear, and lifted away, its noise fading until there was nothing but wind again. I remember standing there for a second after it left, looking at the empty sky, feeling that familiar mix of calm and unease that comes from knowing you are completely on your own. I unlocked the door, went inside, and got to work. I had a full day ahead of me. Routine checks, some maintenance, replacing a failing component, logging readings. Nothing unusual. I put on some music through a small speaker, not loud, just enough to break the monotony and the silence. Otherwise, I was not making much noise. I moved slowly, careful not to slip on the tracked-in snow near the door. The building felt like a bunker, solid and closed off from everything outside. Every now and then, the wind would hit the walls or the roof, and the whole place would give a dull thump or a low groan, but that was normal. I had been there maybe an hour when I heard a knock on the door. It was clear and sharp, metal on metal, not loud, but distinct. It cut through the music and the equipment noise in a way that made my stomach tighten. It was not something I expected. Nobody else was scheduled to be up there. The road was impassable, and the helicopter had already left. For a second, I wondered if maybe the pilot had come back for something, but there was no sound of rotors, no vibration, nothing. I paused, listening. There was no second knock right away. I walked over to the door, feeling a little foolish for being uneasy, and opened it. There was nobody there. The clearing in front of the building was empty, just wind-scoured snow and the faint outline of where the helicopter had landed earlier. I stepped outside, boots crunching, and looked around. The snow was untouched. No footprints, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there at all. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood still and dark, their branches heavy with snow. The wind pushed loose powder across the ground in thin sheets. I stood there for a bit, scanning the area, then shrugged it off. Ice falling from the roof, maybe. Thermal expansion. Buildings make noises, especially up here. I went back inside, closed the door, and went back to work. A couple of minutes later, it happened again. This time the knocking lasted longer. Not just one sharp hit, but a short series spaced out like someone was testing the door or trying to get attention. My skin prickled. I turned the music off without really thinking about it and listened. The knocking stopped. The equipment hummed. The wind moaned faintly outside. I went to the door again and opened it. Again, nobody. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air, and looked harder this time. I walked a few steps away from the door, checking the snow near the walls, near the corners of the building. Still nothing. No tracks. No disturbed snow. The wind had not had time to erase anything. It was clean and smooth, like nobody had been there at all. I went back inside, closed the door, and tried to focus on my work. I told myself it was still probably ice or metal contracting. The building was old. The temperature was low. Strange sounds happened. Then, barely a minute later, the knocking came again. This time it was aggressive. Heavy. Fast. It sounded like someone was pounding on the door with real force, like they were angry or desperate to be let in. The sound echoed inside the small building and seemed to come from everywhere at once. My heart started to race. There was no way ice could do that. There was no way the wind could do that. I grabbed my crowbar from where it leaned against the wall near the tool bench. I did not feel brave. I felt cornered. My mind ran through impossible scenarios. Someone stranded. Someone who should not be there. Someone watching me through the walls somehow. The rational part of my brain kept trying to assert itself, but the fear was louder. I went to the door and yanked it open, crowbar in my hand, fully expecting to see someone standing there. There was nobody. The clearing was still empty. The snow was still perfect and untouched. The wind had picked up a little, but not enough to explain what I had just heard. I stepped outside again, my pulse loud in my ears, and turned slowly in a full circle. I checked behind the building as best I could, trudging through knee-deep snow. Nothing. No movement. No tracks. No sound except the wind and my own breathing. That was when the feeling hit me. The strong sense that I was being watched. It was not dramatic or sudden. It settled in like weight. I found myself staring into the tree line, scanning the shadows between trunks, expecting something to move. My eyes kept darting from place to place. The mountain felt different now, closer, tighter, like it was pressing in on me. I felt exposed standing out there, a single person in a white, empty world. I started to turn back toward the building, telling myself to get inside, lock the door, and calm down. As I turned, something made me look up. Right above the door, centered on the edge of the roof, sat a raven. It was big, bigger than I expected, its feathers glossy black, even in the flat gray light. It was perched comfortably, head tilted slightly, looking straight at me. Its eyes were bright and alert. There was nothing subtle about its expression. If an animal can look amused, that raven did. It was completely at ease, like it owned the place. As I watched, it opened its beak and let out a loud, harsh call, then another, flapping its wings once as if pleased with itself. The sound echoed off the building and the snow. Then it launched itself into the air, powerful wings beating, and flew off toward the trees, disappearing into the gray. I stood there for a long time after that, staring at the empty roof edge. It all made sense in a way that was almost embarrassing. Ravens are smart, smarter than people give them credit for. They watch. They experiment. The metal door, the way it sounded when struck, the way I reacted the first time. The bird had figured it out. It had been landing on the roof edge and hammering on the metal with its beak, enjoying the noise and the response it got. Each time I opened the door, it learned a little more, escalated a little, turned it into a game. Knowing that did not erase the fear right away. My hands were still shaking when I went back inside. I locked the door, put the crowbar down, and sat for a bit on a folding chair, letting my heart slow down. The building felt smaller now, but also safer, the walls thick and solid again. The rest of the day passed without incident. I finished my work, double-checked everything, and kept my music low. Every now and then I thought I heard something on the roof, but it never came again. When the helicopter finally returned in the fading light, the sound was the most welcome thing I had ever heard. As we lifted off and the sight shrank below me, I looked down at the small gray building surrounded by endless white. From the air, it looked insignificant, like a toy dropped on a mountain. I knew better. I knew how alone it was up there, how quiet, how easy it was for your mind to fill in the gaps when something unexpected happened. Back home, warm and safe, the story became almost funny. A raven playing tricks on a lonely worker. A clever bird with too much time on its wings. But even now, I remember the sound of that pounding on the door, the certainty that someone was there, and the cold realization that the wilderness does not need anything supernatural to scare you. Sometimes all it takes is isolation, silence, and an animal smart enough to notice you are alone. I was moving along the Tongariro circuit late in the day, tired in a way that made every step feel heavier than it should. The wind was sharp, slicing across the barren ridges, and I kept my head down, following the thin line of trail markers that stretched endlessly ahead. The circuit was nothing like the main crossing. There were no crowds of tourists, no shouting or laughter echoing off the volcanic slopes. Just me, the ridge, and the constant low hum of wind through the sparse grasses. My backpack felt heavier with every step, and the repetitive terrain made it feel like I was plodding through some endless purgatory. The trail markers seemed to drift on forever, each one just another faint out of color in a landscape that refused to change. My thoughts were simple, almost meditative, until I realized the solitude had begun to press in on me. The ridge was safe, well marked, and I had enough food and water, but there was a strange weight in the air. It was not fear, not exactly, just a quiet unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The emptiness, the constant wind, the endless repetition of rocks and scrub made it feel like the world had dropped away, leaving me alone on a knife edge of nothingness. I kept moving, head down, focusing on the next marker, the next step, counting them in my mind to keep the creeping sense of unreality at bay. Weeks later, I found myself in southern British Columbia, climbing up a trail to a lookout with a group of friends. It was a completely different kind of hike, greener, denser, alive with the smell of moss and pine. The air was thick and cool, carrying the faint cry of birds far below the ridge. We made good time up, reaching the lookout with sun still high, and paused only briefly to take in a view. The descent began smoothly, familiar, and comfortable. About 20 minutes into the return, we reached a stretch we had already passed on the way up. I froze when I saw it, fresh cougar dung, dark and still steaming slightly. It was a visceral, immediate reminder that we were sharing this space with something potentially dangerous. None of us had children or dogs with us, and the chances of an attack were low, but the reminder was enough to put our nerves on edge. Every step down felt heavier, the forest around us seeming to stretch and twist like the shadows themselves were watching. We moved steadily, deliberately, ears straining for any hint of movement, hearts ticking louder than usual. The forest was alive, yes, but with a silent, patient predator that had the whole terrain memorized. The fact that it was invisible only made it more frightening. The Glass House Mountains offered a different kind of fear altogether. My friend and I were hiking, two women traveling together, enjoying the quiet peaks and jagged outlines of the terrain. At the summit, a man appeared, casual at first, striking up a conversation. But it quickly soured. His comments became suggestive, his eyes lingering where they shouldn't. My friend noticed before I did, whispering that we should head back. I confronted him, blunt and direct, telling him to leave us alone. He didn't take the hint. He began following us down the trail, a persistent shadow that refused to vanish. We had to raise our voices, alerting a muscular hiker nearby, before we could shake him off. Later, as we set up camp, the shadows outside our tent seemed to stretch longer than the night itself. We heard his voice asking our neighbors if they had seen us. We stayed hidden, silent, hoping that he would not find us. The next day, we met other travelers who had encountered the same man. He had been roaming from hostel to campsite, looking for two women methodically, obsessively. The realization that someone had been searching for us across the area, intent and patient, left a lasting coldness in my chest. There's a fear that isn't wild. It doesn't roar or pounce. It lingers quietly, a presence you cannot see but can feel. In Maine, the forest offered a different, almost primal fear. Sitting around a campfire, enjoying the crackle and the smell of wood smoke, a sudden crash shattered the calm. From the darkness, a massive bull moose surged into the clearing, moving impossibly fast through the campsite before vanishing back into the forest. The sheer scale of the animal, its raw power and speed, made my stomach twist. There had been no warning, no signs, only the sudden and overwhelming presence of a creature entirely at home in its own wild domain. The rest of the evening was spent with heightened senses, every rustle of branches and snap of twigs triggering immediate reflexes. The moose had left, but the memory of it lingered like a physical weight pressing against the back of my neck. Then there was the Rocky Mountains, where fear took a more psychological turn. We were halfway through a remote trail, the air cool and crisp, when a scream tore through the valley, a high-pitched, startling sound that echoed in a way that made it impossible to place its source. I assumed cougar, the sound distant enough to not pose immediate danger, but unsettling nonetheless. Moments later, my friend began laughing, at first lightly, then hysterically. I turned to see her spooked, her laugh vibrating through the silence, and then it began again. Our own voices, somehow carried and returned by the landscape, filled the forest from all directions. It was disorienting, claustrophobic, and deeply unsettling. We were four adults, fully capable and rational, yet the echo of our own presence made us question everything around us. With the option to continue along a secluded track or join a busier trail, we chose safety, pushing toward the crowded path. Even then, faint echoes of the scream lingered. Whispers of laughter carried on the wind whenever the trail emptied. The forest seemed to hold its breath, playing with our perception, reminding us how small we were in its vast, untamed spaces. In every one of these experiences, the fear was different. On Tongariro, it was the creeping, existential weight of isolation. In British Columbia, it was the sharp, immediate awareness of a predator nearby. In the Glass House Mountains, it was human threat, calculated, deliberate, invasive. Maine offered raw, uncontainable natural force. The Rockies gave the mind's vulnerability, how even familiar things, our own voices, could become alien and terrifying in the right context. In each case, the resolution was practical, grounded in human awareness and action. On Tongariro, I made it to the hut, warmed up, and rested. In BC, we descended carefully, staying alert until we reached safety. In Glass House, we avoided the man, stayed with others, and continued our travel, cautious but unbroken. In Maine, the moose left, and we retreated safely to the van. In the Rockies, we chose the safer trail, moved steadily to where other hikers would be, and regained calm. Fear was present, intense, sometimes overwhelming, but always manageable with attention, care, and a willingness to respect the environment, the animals, and other people. By the end, I learned that fear is layered, nuanced, and deeply real, but it can be met and overcome by patience, awareness, and practical action. Each step forward was a reclaiming of space, a return to clarity, and a reminder that the wilderness, however imposing or frightening, could be navigated without harm if approached with respect and caution. It stayed with me, all of it, as a series of lessons on alertness, boundaries, and survival. And when I finally looked back on those trails, each one seemed less like a place of danger and more like a place that tested every part of me. And in passing that test, I walked away stronger, clearer, and profoundly aware of the thin line between comfort and fear, solitude and vulnerability, human and wild. I worked as a park ranger for years, mostly at a national wildlife refuge that had a strange past. Before it became a refuge, it had been a U.S. Army research and development site. For decades, soldiers had tested all kinds of things there: barbed wire barricades, flame retardant fabrics, explosives, and God knows what else. By the time I arrived in the early 2000s, there had been roughly 10 years of cleanup, but the place still had a feeling of being off. Even after the public was allowed in, the trails were lined with warning signs, and people were strictly forbidden from wandering off them. For rangers, though, that rule was more like a guideline. Sometimes you had to go off trail, whether it was checking old access roads, inspecting leftover debris, or investigating reports from hikers. One afternoon, I was sent to check an old portion of the refuge that had been closed for years. The sky was pale, the kind of gray that makes the woods feel heavier than they are, and the air was sticky with humidity. I parked near a trailhead, and followed an overgrown path that eventually disappeared under ferns and fallen logs. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but a suffocating quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, nothing but my own boots crunching over dead leaves. I knew the area had a lot of leftover military debris, but I wasn't expecting what I stumbled on. A few hundred yards ahead, I saw movement, or what I thought was movement. 6 figures, standing perfectly still. My stomach dropped. Hunters? People with guns? I froze, keeping my distance. The forest was dense, and the light filtering through the canopy made their forms dark and vaguely human. My hand instinctively went to my radio, but I hesitated. I called out my presence in a loud, professional voice. "Park Ranger. Checking area. Please identify yourself." Still nothing. My heart was pounding. Something about them didn't feel right. I slowly approached, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. As I got closer, the outlines became clearer. They weren't people. They were mannequins, 6 of them, standing in a rough semicircle, dressed in tattered military uniforms. Their bodies were badly burnt. Their faces melted into grotesque expressions frozen in place. I couldn't help staring. Each one seemed deliberately posed like a macabre display. A wave of nausea and shivers ran through me. I leaned on my training to stay calm and observe my surroundings, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But there was no one. The forest swallowed every sound. Later, after catching my breath back at the ranger station, I did some research. The mannequins had been used for flame-retardant fabric testing decades before, left behind in some forgotten corner of the site. Even knowing that, seeing them in person, in the middle of the woods, was unnerving. They weren't mannequins you expected to find in a store. They were blackened, scorched, and staring at you as though they'd witnessed every terrible thing humans could do. The eerie stillness of the forest, combined with the bizarre display, made it one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my career. That wasn't the only time I had an encounter that made me reconsider the wildlife refuge's quiet, seemingly safe facade. On another occasion, I was called to investigate a report of strange noises along a seldom-used trail. The trail was narrow, covered in pine needles, and twisted through a dense area where the canopy blocked almost all sunlight. As I moved deeper into the forest, I started noticing the smell first, a sharp, metallic tang, like old blood mixed with decay. Following the scent, I came across the aftermath of a coyote kill. A deer, or maybe a smaller animal, had been dragged apart, its remains half-eaten, scattered across the forest floor. Bones cracked underfoot, fur matted with dirt and blood. The coyotes hadn't left, of course. I could hear them further in the shadows, their low growls and movements making the trees feel alive in a predatory way. I stayed calm, documenting everything for the report, and retreated slowly, knowing that getting caught in the wrong place with predators this far from the trail could be dangerous. There was another incident on the 4th of July, which, looking back, was more chaotic than frightening, but still unforgettable. A local group of people, apparently drug users, had set up a makeshift party in one of the old fields, somewhere far from any trail. They had fireworks, fire pits, and all kinds of flammable materials scattered everywhere. When I stumbled upon them, it was a dangerous scene. Cracked, rusted cans of fireworks leaned against wooden pallets. Someone had built a small bonfire next to a brush pile, and there were improvised structures that could collapse at any moment. I had to intervene, calling for backup, making sure everyone got out safely, and securing the area. The smell of smoke lingered for days, mixed with burnt plastic and alcohol. It was surreal to see how quickly people could turn a secluded, seemingly tranquil wildlife refuge into something that felt completely lawless. Each of these experiences taught me that the refuge, while beautiful and full of wildlife, held a darker history that never fully went away. The forest didn't have to be haunted to be frightening. Human activity, whether past or present, could make it more unnerving than any ghost story. The burnt mannequins, the coyote kill, the illegal parties, all reminders that even in a place meant for peace and nature, danger could be lurking just off the trail. In the end, I came to respect the rules for a reason. The trails were there to protect both visitors and the wildlife, but also to keep people away from the leftover hazards of a bygone military site. While the refuge had been cleaned up, some things were never meant to be disturbed, or at least they could unsettle anyone who stumbled upon them. I learned to always check reports, carry backup, and trust my instincts in the woods. Walking alone, off trail, I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural. They're the remnants of human experimentation, careless behavior, and the unpredictability of nature itself. Years later, whenever I patrol the refuge, I remember the first time I saw those burnt mannequins. Even now, their memory brings a chill, a reminder that the forest has secrets, and not all of them are meant to be understood. The refuge is safe now, mostly quiet and peaceful, but I always take a little longer to look around, making sure the shadows aren't hiding something unexpected. Because I know from experience that even in the most controlled, protected wilderness, danger isn't always obvious, and sometimes it's standing perfectly still, waiting for you to notice. The forest can seem calm, almost serene, but I learned that the calm can be misleading. Humans leave a mark that lasts, sometimes decades after the fact. And walking alone in a place like that, even knowing the history, you can still feel your stomach drop at the sight of something you don't understand. That's why I always finish my patrols, document what I see, and stick to the trails whenever possible. It's not about fear. It's about respect for the wilderness and the reminders of what came before. In the end, that respect is what keeps you safe and maybe even sane in a place where the past still lingers in the most unsettling ways. I was out on one of the trails near my house, wandering with the dogs on a late afternoon that had started off clear, but was growing hazy with clouds rolling in from the west. The forest had that heavy, damp smell from the last rain, mixed with the sharp, earthy scent of pine needles underfoot. My dogs were loose but alert, ears twitching, tails high as they sniffed through the underbrush. It was one of those days where the woods feel alive in a quiet, patient way, every small snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seeming amplified. I had been hiking this trail for years, knew its turns and hidden paths, but even familiarity doesn't always make the woods feel safe. As we were moving along a narrower part of the trail, I noticed something out of place on the ground. At first, I thought it was just a large stick, maybe part of a fallen tree. But as I got closer, the shape became unmistakable. It was a deer leg, fresh, the kind of freshness that makes your stomach tighten. The skin was still smooth, the muscle tissue intact, the bone not yet exposed from scavenging. I knew immediately it hadn't been there long. My first thought was the local wildlife, coyotes, cougars, something had likely taken it down. I scanned the surrounding area carefully, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. Nothing else of the deer was visible, no blood trail, no tracks of struggle. It was as though the rest had been carried off silently by predators that I wouldn't see, and yet I could feel their presence in the rustling leaves and the occasional distant bark of a coyote. I kept my eyes moving constantly, scanning the tree-line for movement, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The dogs sensed it too. They stayed unervingly close, circling back to me every few steps, ears perked, growls low and cautious. My first instinct was to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the house. The woods were familiar, but this piece of evidence reminded me of the real danger lingering just out of sight. Coyotes are sneaky, and cougars are patient and fast. Neither gives warnings. I kept the dogs close, moved cautiously, every branch snap echoing loudly in my ears. The rest of the hike back felt tense, measured, the peaceful walk replaced with alertness that made my senses almost ache from overuse. By the time we reached the clearing near the car, the feeling of relief was physical, almost dizzying, like escaping a room filled with smoke. A few weeks later, I had another close encounter that reminded me just how unpredictable the wilderness could be. This time, I was out taking photos near a river that runs off one of the trails. A thunderstorm had been rolling in, dark clouds swelling quickly overhead, and I was racing against time to get a few shots of the water cascading over rocks and under fallen logs. I'd left the trail to get a better angle, scrambling through thick bushes and over damp soil that stuck to my boots. I knew the storm would arrive fast. The air had that tight, electric feeling just before lightning strikes. My camera was in my hands, heavy but steady, lens catching the faint glimmer of light before the rain began. I'd stopped to adjust the lens, crouched low to get a shot of a reflection in a pool of water, when I heard it, a low crunch of branches behind me. I turned instinctively and froze. There, no more than 20 feet away, was a massive male moose. I've seen moose before, plenty of times, but nothing prepared me for the sheer size and presence of this animal. His antlers were enormous, sprawling outward like a wild sculpture of bone and sinew. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and watchful. For a solid minute, we stared at each other, the tension thick enough to feel it pressing against my chest. Every instinct screamed to stay still, to avoid triggering aggression. Moose are known to be unpredictable, and a male that sighs in rut or agitated by weather could easily charge. I edged back slowly, my hand brushing a tree that looked climbable just in case. The rain started in little pinpricks first, hitting the leaves, then picking up into heavier drops that drummed against the soil and the canopy above. The moose didn't move toward me. He seemed more interested in grazing. Even so, I kept my eyes on him, every muscle in my body tense, ready to leap sideways if he decided to turn. He took his time moving along the trail, deliberately, with that lumbering, unhurried gait that makes their size all the more imposing. I could see the water beginning to bead on his back, dark fur slick and shining in the dim light. My boots were soaked, my jacket heavy with rain, but adrenaline kept me rigid. When he finally moved past and disappeared around a bend, I exhaled fully for the first time. My hands were shaking, but the shaking was more from relief than fear now. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, letting the rain wash over me, letting my pulse slow. The storm hit hard shortly after, heavy rain bouncing off the trail, turning soil into mud, filling the air with the scent of wet pine and earth. I carefully made my way back to the main path, footing uncertain in the slick conditions, dogs staying at my heels, equally drenched but alert. Each step felt deliberate, measured, cautious, but also increasingly confident as I saw the clearing of the trail ahead. By the time I reached the car, the storm was in full swing. Sheets of rain streaked across the windshield, the forest around me a blur of wet greens and browns. The dogs shook themselves vigorously, sending droplets flying everywhere, and I laughed softly at the sight, the tension finally leaving my shoulders. I realized as I started the engine and headed home that both encounters, seeing the deer leg and then facing the moose, were stark reminders of how small and vulnerable humans really are in the wilderness. The forest doesn't wait for anyone. It doesn't care about familiarity, skill, or experience. You are a visitor, moving through a system that operates on instincts and survival, and any misstep can be fatal. At home, I dried the dogs, hung up wet jackets and boots, and made myself a strong cup of coffee, still feeling the cold sweat from the moose encounter. I sat by the window, looking out at the trees where the storm was now passing, and thought about how much of the forest remains hidden just beyond sight. The deer had been taken quickly by something larger, silent, patient. The moose had been a living, breathing reminder of power I couldn't hope to match. Both incidents made me more cautious, more respectful of the boundaries of nature. I didn't go back to that trail for several weeks, letting the images and sensations settle in my mind. When I finally did, I moved differently, slower, more deliberate, more aware. I made sure the dog stayed close, that my phone was charged, that I had water and extra gear. The woods were still beautiful, still inviting, but I carried with me the memory of the quiet danger that had passed through it alongside me. It was a lesson in vigilance, in respect, and in understanding that even familiar paths can hold surprises. That day, the deer leg and the moose weren't just reminders. They were warnings, clear and unforgettable, about the balance of life and death that exists quietly, endlessly in the forest. By nightfall, the forest had settled into calm again. I stayed inside, listening to the rain dripping from the eaves, reflecting on the fragile sense of safety humans often take for granted. Both encounters had ended without violence, without injury, but the lessons were sharp. Nature had a rhythm I could follow, a set of rules I could respect, and if I stayed alert, I could continue to move through it safely. Walking through the woods after that day felt different. I felt smaller, yes, but also more connected, more aware of the life surrounding me, from the smallest rustling leaves to the massive forms of the creatures that walk silently, patiently through the trees. It was a clarity that left me both humbled and strangely relieved, knowing I had seen the forest on its terms and had survived with nothing more than my respect and caution as protection. I was doing my usual late afternoon patrol on one of the quieter trails of the park, the ones most hikers avoid because they're remote and winding. It was early October, the sun was low, and the woods had that sharp, dry smell of fallen leaves. I had driven my Ranger truck along a narrow dirt service road until I hit a fork where the trailhead started, then I parked and grabbed my standard gear, a flashlight, a handheld radio, binoculars, and a small first aid kit. The air was crisp, and the shadows were stretching long across the ground. I had been working this park for over 7 years, and I thought I knew these trails like the back of my hand. But that day reminded me how little you can actually predict in the forest. I followed one of the hiking trails that led deep into a part of the park that saw almost no traffic, a section of dense pines and oaks with occasional clearings. The underbrush was thick, and my boots sank slightly into the damp forest floor. I was paying attention to signs of wildlife and fallen branches when I spotted something unusual, a deer leg lying across the trail. It hadn't started decomposing yet, which told me it was recent. I froze for a second, scanning the surrounding area. Normally, I'd expect scavengers or maybe the remains of a carcass nearby, but there was nothing else. No blood, no tracks, nothing. Just that single deer leg. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. I radioed my station to report what I'd found, describing the location and the object. They told me to investigate carefully, but to call back if anything escalated. I pulled on gloves and carefully lifted the leg to examine it, checking for any marks or unusual wounds. The clean cut looked almost surgical, but I know from experience that animals or humans can leave sharp, clean marks in certain situations. I scanned the trees and the brush around the clearing, looking for signs of who or what might have been responsible. I found nothing. I decided to follow the direction the leg might have come from, thinking there could be a wounded animal or a hunter's trap set nearby. I moved slowly, my eyes straining in the dimming light, my flashlight sweeping the forest floor and low branches. That's when I saw a thin line of blood leading off the trail into a dense patch of undergrowth. My pulse picked up slightly, not with fear exactly, but with the heightened alertness every ranger feels in situations that don't make immediate sense. I followed it, keeping my ears open for any sounds. The forest was eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. As I pressed forward, I noticed something even stranger. The blood trail stopped abruptly. I expected it to lead to a deer or a hunter, maybe someone injured, but it just ended. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. The forest seemed to swallow the trail entirely. I stepped back, scanning the area from different angles, trying to see any sign I might have missed. Then I caught movement, a flash of something large slipping behind the trees. I froze and waited, watching the shadows stretch and twist. The movement was deliberate but cautious, staying just out of sight. My mind raced through possibilities, an injured deer, a hunter hiding, or maybe something else entirely. I decided to retreat to the trail and head back toward my truck. I had walked far enough in, and without clear evidence of what I was tracking, it would be unsafe to go deeper alone. My flashlight bobbed over the forest floor as I retraced my steps, and I stayed hyper-aware, imagining shadows could be lurking just beyond my vision. It was one of those moments where the forest feels alive in a way that is both beautiful and unnerving. When I reached my truck, I called dispatch and reported everything I'd found. The deer leg, the trail of blood, the sudden disappearance of both. They asked if I wanted backup to investigate further, and I agreed. By the time the second ranger arrived, it was nearly dark. We retraced my path together, scanning with flashlights and keeping radios ready, but the forest revealed nothing else. No signs of an animal, no evidence of human presence, nothing. We did a grid search around the initial spot and found no more remains. The next day, I returned to the same location during daylight, hoping the sun would make anything visible. This time, I spotted faint tire tracks partially hidden by leaves on a nearby service path. A small off-road vehicle, like an ATV. That explained some of the clean cuts and the missing deer. Someone had likely been poaching and trying to cover their tracks. I followed the tracks to a clearing where a few small ATVs were hidden in the brush, with hunting gear strewn around. There were fresh deer carcasses, skinned and removed from sight. The people responsible had fled overnight when the area became too dangerous to operate. I documented everything, took photographs, and called wildlife officers for further investigation. Over the next week, the park put up warning signs and increased patrols in that section. Eventually, the poachers were caught because local law enforcement traced the ATV's owners. That day taught me how quickly the forest can hide human activity and how unpredictable even a familiar park can be. What started as a small, almost mundane discovery, a deer leg on a trail, turned into uncovering a significant illegal operation. The forest returned to its normal rhythm after that, with deer moving through the same trails, birds nesting, and hikers occasionally passing through. But I never forgot the way the shadows had shifted that evening, how quiet it became, and how the trail ended with nothing visible. Being a park ranger isn't just about enforcing rules or maintaining trails. It's about seeing the signs others miss and understanding the hidden dangers of nature and people alike. That day reminded me why vigilance is never optional, why every patrol matters, and why even in familiar places, you can never truly relax. The forest stayed quiet after that, almost as if it was waiting, but I felt more prepared. I knew that no matter how calm it looks, there are always things hidden in plain sight, and sometimes noticing them is the difference between walking away safely and getting caught in something you can't control. That experience stayed with me, and every time I walk those trails, I move a little slower, look a little closer, and never forget that in the woods, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. I have been a park ranger for nearly 7 years at a sprawling national forest in the Northern Rockies. The kind of place where the trees stretch so high that even at noon, shadows stretch long across the ground, and the air carries a constant, damp, earthy scent. Most days were routine, patrolling trails, checking on hikers, looking out for illegal campers or hunters. But there were nights when the forest reminded you just how unpredictable and raw it could be. One of those nights I'll never forget. It was early October, right after the first frost had started to creep into the lower elevations. I was finishing up a long solo patrol on one of the more remote northwestern trails, a place the visitors rarely ventured. The sun had dipped behind the mountains hours ago, and the forest had taken on a deep, shadowy quiet. I switched on my headlamp, which barely penetrated the dense blackness beyond the trail, and checked the map on my tablet. The plan was to make a full loop and get back to my ranger station before midnight. A couple of miles in, I noticed something unusual on the trail. There was a faint set of tire tracks, too narrow for a standard pickup, leading off into the trees about 50 feet from the trail. They weren't fresh enough to be slick with mud, but they were recent enough that the grass around them was pressed down. At first, I figured it was just someone using a dirt bike illegally. That happens more than you'd think, even in areas with strict rules. But something about the way the tracks veered sharply downhill made my stomach tense. That part of the forest was nearly inaccessible, a slope so steep and rocky that even an ATV would struggle. I decided to investigate, walking slowly along the tracks. The forest floor was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and sharp rocks. Every step I took made the dry leaves crackle, echoing unnaturally in the still night air. The tracks led to a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to see a makeshift campsite. A fire pit had been hastily constructed, and there were scraps of packaging, food wrappers, a torn piece of sleeping bag, and a half-empty backpack leaning against a tree. It looked abandoned, but the details didn't sit right. The sleeping bag looked like it had been used recently, and the fire pit had ash that hadn't fully cooled. I started a careful perimeter check, scanning with my flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a line of small, smeared footprints leading into the woods from the campsite. They were human, no bigger than a teenager's, but irregular. It looked like someone had been in a hurry, maybe even limping. The deeper I followed them, the quieter the forest became. My headlamp barely reached 10 feet ahead, and the trees became thicker. The footprints vanished near a fallen log, but I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trunks. I froze. My hand instinctively went to my radio, but the signal was spotty in that part of the forest. I whispered into it anyway, stating my location. No reply. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but my gut told me otherwise. The tracks, the campsite, the abrupt movement, they didn't line up with normal wildlife activity. I slowly turned back to head toward the trail when I saw it. A figure crouched low behind a thick tree, barely moving. I couldn't make out features in the dark, but I could feel its eyes on me. My first instinct was to retreat, but the slope behind me was steep, and I was alone. I stayed frozen, waiting, my heart hammering. Then, without a sound, the figure slipped further into the shadows and disappeared. I waited several long minutes, listening. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, just the oppressive quiet of the forest. Realizing I couldn't stay there forever, I carefully backtracked to the trail, my senses on high alert. My mind raced, thinking of possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone hiding? Or something worse, someone using the forest as a place to escape the law? I reached my truck after nearly 30 minutes, the beams of the headlights cutting through the dark. The relief hit me like a wave. I locked the doors and radioed my supervisor. By the time law enforcement arrived to investigate, there was no one at the campsite, and the tracks had been partially washed out by the cold evening wind. The official report concluded that it was likely a trespasser who had set up a temporary camp and moved on, but I knew better. There was something calculated in the way the campsite had been abandoned. Something that suggested whoever it was, they had been watching the trail, waiting for the right moment. I didn't sleep that night. Not really, replaying the shadow, the footprints, the cold certainty that someone had been close enough to touch me if they had wanted to. Weeks later, the forest returned to its usual quiet. I kept patrolling the same area, always checking for traces of campsites or tracks, and I never saw the figure again. But the experience changed how I approached the forest. I learned to respect the darkness, to trust instinct over logic, and to never underestimate the isolation of the wilderness. The forest isn't haunted by ghosts. It doesn't need to be. Its scariest moments are made of real things. Shadows, silence, and the knowledge that you might not be alone, even when it seems like you are. I was on a routine patrol deep in the forest, miles from the main park roads, when I stumbled across something that has stayed with me ever since. It was late afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the dense trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the narrow dirt trail I was following. The air was heavy and still, almost suffocating, with the faint smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. I had driven my old Ranger truck as far as it could go, leaving it parked under a thick canopy where sunlight barely touched the ground, and continued on foot. It was the kind of section of the park that few ever saw, untouched, wild, and unpredictable. I noticed it first out of the corner of my eye, a small pile of branches and leaves that seemed off. When I got closer, my stomach sank. It wasn't a pile of branches at all. It was the remains of a deer, fresh, with its leg severed cleanly. There was no sign of decomposition. No scavengers had touched it yet. Something had killed it recently, and it was deliberate. I had seen roadkill and bears tearing through carcasses, but this was different. Someone, or something, had taken precise action. My mind immediately ran through the possibilities. Poachers were illegal in this area, but not impossible. Still, the thought that made my stomach tighten the most was that whoever had done this was still out there somewhere. I called it in on my radio, keeping my voice steady, describing the location and the condition of the deer. Dispatch confirmed they would send a team in the morning, but I was alone until then. I continued my patrol cautiously, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. The forest felt heavier, the usual sounds of birds and wind reduced to faint whispers. The deeper I went, the more I noticed odd signs. Footprints that didn't match the size or stride of any ranger or hiker, small cut marks on the bark of trees that didn't look natural, and the occasional discarded piece of cloth, weathered and torn. Every instinct I had screamed that something wasn't right. Night came fast, faster than usual in this remote area. I set up a temporary camp, using my small lantern to light a circle around me. I stayed close to my truck's location, keeping the engine ready in case I needed to drive out fast. The forest at night was alive in a different way. Shadows seemed to move with purpose, and every rustle or snap of a branch made my heart jump. I tried to stay logical. Predators were natural, human threats were rare, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Around midnight, I noticed something moving in the distance. My flashlight caught a shadow, moving low to the ground, fast and deliberate. I froze, knowing I shouldn't make noise. It vanished before I could get a good look, leaving only the disturbed underbrush and a silence so thick it pressed against my ears. My mind raced with what it could be, an animal, a poacher, or someone hiding in the trees. I didn't move until the shape disappeared entirely, then double-checked my surroundings, every sense alert. I knew one mistake could be dangerous, but I had no choice but to stay. The next morning, I began my hike back toward the main road, determined to report what I'd seen in person. The forest had changed overnight. The air was lighter, the birds had returned, and the forest floor seemed calmer. I followed the trail I had marked the day before, but now I noticed something else. More signs of activity, but organized. Footprints circling in a pattern. Areas of the underbrush flattened, as if someone had been camping, and remnants of tools like ropes and hooks abandoned in the mud. Whoever had been here was skilled, careful, and possibly watching the area for weeks. By the time I reached the main road, I had a plan. I marked every sign, took pictures, and left detailed notes. Dispatch had already sent a team, and over the next few days, a group of rangers combed the area. We found additional deer remains, some traps, and finally evidence of illegal hunting operations that had been hidden in this remote section of the park for months. The person responsible had been poaching animals at night, taking what they needed and moving quietly before anyone could catch them. The evidence we collected led to arrests, and the forest slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Even though the threat was removed, I never forgot that night. Walking alone in the dark, knowing that someone could be hiding in the shadows, watching me, left a mark that stayed with me. The forest can be beautiful and peaceful, but it is also wild and unpredictable, full of people and animals who respect no rules. I learned to respect that unpredictability, to always remain vigilant, and to understand that the safety of the park often depends on one person noticing the small, strange details that most would overlook. That patrol and the tension of that night taught me more about fear, observation, and patience than any training ever could. Even today, when I patrol the same area, I remember that deer leg and the signs of someone moving silently through the forest. I know what it means to be alone in a wilderness that is larger and stranger than I can fully comprehend, and I carry that knowledge with me every step I take. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though it was years ago. I had been working as a park ranger for a few seasons by then, mostly patrolling the backcountry trails, checking campsites, and responding to reports from hikers and hunters. That summer, the park had been unusually dry. Fires had cropped up in the past weeks, and the forest smelled like a mixture of pine and dry earth, with smoke from distant blazes drifting lazily through the air. My assignment that day was a routine one. Patrol a remote section of the park where hikers rarely went, a place where the forest thickened and the trail narrowed until it was little more than a dirt path winding through dense trees and undergrowth. I started early in the morning, packing my usual gear, radio, water, first aid kit, and binoculars before loading my small Ranger truck. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the kind of quiet drive that makes you aware of how far you are from civilization. The birds were already awake, and I could hear the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush even before I parked. I locked the truck, slung my pack over my shoulders, and set off down the trail. The forest grew thicker quickly, with towering pines and oaks forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, scattered beams. The air was dry and still, almost too still, like the world had paused and forgotten this part of the park. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes and ears alert. I had learned over the years that these quiet woods could hide dangers if you weren't careful. Broken branches, fresh animal tracks, and the occasional discarded trash gave subtle clues about recent activity in this remote corner. About 3 miles into the trail, I came across something that immediately set my nerves on edge. The remains of a deer, freshly killed. Its body was torn and bloodied, but it hadn't yet begun to decay. The sharp smell of iron in the air made me pause. The deer's body was unusual, not just because of the freshness, but because of the way it had been left. It looked careless, as if whoever, or whatever, had killed it hadn't intended to eat it, just to leave it as a warning. I scanned the surrounding area, eyes darting between the trees, listening for the slightest rustle, but the forest was silent. I called it in over the radio, describing the location and condition of the deer, expecting the usual response. Noted, keep moving and stay safe. I kept walking, but my steps were slower, more deliberate. I knew I was alone out here. Even the trail, which usually showed signs of other hikers, was empty. No footprints, no recent activity except for the deer. A strange feeling settled over me, a tightening in my chest that made me acutely aware of every sound, every shadow. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Small branches were broken in patterns that suggested movement. Someone or something had passed through recently. I found more tracks, this time not animal. The prints were large, irregular, and they led off the trail, disappearing into thick undergrowth. My gut told me to follow them cautiously, but my training reminded me of the dangers. I marked the location mentally and continued patrolling along the main path, keeping my senses sharp. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent. The forest shadows lengthened, twisting in ways that made the trees look alive, though I knew it was just light and perspective. I reached a small clearing, a place I knew well where the trail split. I paused to check my map and radio, but the radio had no signal. That part of the park was notorious for cutting out communications. My heart rate picked up slightly. I hated being cut off in the backcountry, but it wasn't unusual. I always carried enough supplies for a long night. Still, something about this place felt different. I started heading back along a different path that looped toward the main ranger station. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling from the underbrush, too deliberate to be a normal animal. I froze, listening. The sound moved with purpose, and I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything. My training kicked in. Move quietly, don't panic, stay aware. I slowly drew my flashlight and scanned the area. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees. The rustling stopped when I moved, then started again further down the path, always keeping its distance. I realized I was being followed. Whoever, or whatever, was out here was aware of me and testing my movements. I didn't run. Running in the woods alone is the fastest way to get injured or lost. Instead, I kept moving at a steady pace, always staying aware of my surroundings. I checked the deer site in my mind, realizing the tracks probably belonged to whoever had killed it. That thought made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just random wildlife. Something human had been out here, hunting or lurking, and they hadn't expected anyone to find their work. By the time I reached my truck, the forest had swallowed the light of the setting sun. I didn't wait, jumped in, started the engine, and kept the headlights off until I was sure I hadn't been followed. I drove slowly back to the ranger station, checking the mirrors constantly. When I finally reached the paved road, I felt a strange sense of relief, though my nerves were still on edge. At the station, I filed a report with the chief. He sent another ranger to check the area the next day, and they found more deer carcasses, all killed in the same careless, bloody manner, but no sign of the perpetrator. Over the next few weeks, we increased patrols, left warnings for hikers, and eventually the tracks disappeared. We never found who did it, but the park slowly returned to normal. Even now, years later, I remember that day vividly. The woods were just woods, and the danger was human, not supernatural. The fear wasn't from monsters or ghosts, but from a knowledge that someone had been out there in the same quiet forest I patrolled, and I had been lucky to leave without a confrontation. The forest went back to its quiet self, but I always carry that memory with me. A reminder that in the backcountry, the scariest things are the ones that don't announce themselves. I remember one of the darkest nights of my time as a park ranger. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of how sharply reality can shift when you're alone in the middle of the wilderness. It started like any other evening on patrol in the northern section of the park. The sun was just dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the dirt roads and dense pine groves. I had just finished my last inspection of the lower campgrounds, making sure that campers had their fires properly contained and that the trails were clear of debris. The park was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that presses in on you if you stay still long enough. My truck's headlights cut through the growing darkness as I made my way back up the forest road toward the ranger station. The air smelled like wet pine and earth, the sort of smell that reminds you how far you are from civilization. About 15 minutes into the drive, I noticed something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe an elk. But as I slowed down, I realized it wasn't moving. My stomach tightened. It was a deer's leg, completely severed from the body, lying in the dirt. The rest of the animal wasn't visible anywhere nearby. The muscle and tissue were fresh, not decomposed at all, which meant whatever had killed it had done so recently. The dark red of the blood was still vivid against the brown soil. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, scanning the surrounding forest. My flashlight cut through the dense trees, revealing nothing. No animal, no tracks, nothing. My first thought was some sort of predator, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the way the leg was cleanly severed didn't fit any natural predation I'd seen in years of patrolling these woods. Bears and mountain lions rarely slice through an animal like that. They tear, they rip. This was precise. My skin prickled, and I felt that old sense of unease you get when something in the wild feels off, something that doesn't fit the natural rhythm of the forest. I called it in over the radio, reporting the leg and asking if any other rangers had seen anything similar. The reply was slow, static-filled, and uncertain. No one had seen anything, and by the time I was done, the sky was almost entirely black. I returned to my truck and kept my lights sweeping the roadside as I drove slowly back toward the main road, constantly watching the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, which had felt calm and empty earlier, now seemed alive with shadows. As I drove, I noticed the brush moving slightly on the side of the road. At first, I told myself it was the wind. The branches were low, the kind that would brush a truck window if you drove too close. But the movement was deliberate, smooth, almost too controlled to be the wind. My heart began to race. I flipped on the high beams and slowed the truck to a crawl. Something darted between the trees, fast, silent, and just out of the reach of my lights. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like a deer or any normal forest animal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and reminded myself to stay calm. I decided to stick to the main road and head straight back to the ranger station. The park wasn't very big, but the northern sections were remote and cell service was spotty at best. I couldn't rely on immediate backup. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, and I kept scanning for movement, my flashlight ready to shine into the woods if needed. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle more deliberate. About half a mile from the ranger station, I saw tire tracks on the dirt shoulder, partially obscured by fallen leaves. The tracks weren't fresh, but they were recent enough that they caught my attention. Someone had been here, maybe even watching me. I felt a wave of adrenaline mixed with dread. Whoever or whatever had left those tracks had to be nearby. I continued slowly, making mental notes of every sound. The crunch of my tires, the distant call of a lone owl, the subtle snapping of twigs. Nothing else moved. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was tense but rational. I radioed in the discovery, marking the location of the leg and the tracks for follow-up in the morning. The deputy who arrived shortly after me agreed that it looked like human activity, not an animal, though there was no immediate threat left at the scene. We stayed through the night at the station, keeping lights on and windows checked. By sunrise, a more thorough search of the area revealed nothing unusual. No body, no evidence beyond the leg and tracks. Whatever had happened had vanished into the forest without a trace. In the days that followed, I kept patrols longer in that section of the park. The leg was sent for analysis, and it turned out to be from a deer, likely killed by a human. Poachers. That was the reality. Not ghosts, not monsters, just someone willing to risk the law for a meal or trophies. Over time, I realized that the fear I felt that night wasn't from the darkness or the unknown. It was from the cold realization that someone had been in the woods with lethal precision, and that we might not even know it. I still patrol that park every season, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I remember the severed leg, the movement in the trees, and the tire tracks. It taught me to respect not only the wild animals, but the humans who move silently in the shadows. The forest is honest, but people could be unpredictable, dangerous, and quietly lethal. That night stayed with me, a reminder that the scariest things in the wilderness aren't always what you expect. I remember one night on patrol that stuck with me more than any other. I was a park ranger at a large national forest, responsible for a vast stretch of wilderness where the trails were barely marked and cell service was practically non-existent. It was early October, the nights were getting longer and colder, and the forest had that heavy, damp smell that comes after the first autumn rains. I was on a routine solo patrol, driving slowly along the dirt access roads in my old Ranger truck, listening to the tires crunch over the wet leaves. The moon was almost full, but the clouds moved in strange, fast bursts, casting flickering shadows through the trees. It was quiet, so quiet that the hum of the truck engine sounded almost loud against it. I had been driving for nearly 2 hours on a narrow road that twisted through dense pine and oak. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, pine needles, and broken branches. The air was cold, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I was used to being alone, and I prided myself on noticing the subtle signs of the forest: fresh animal tracks, disturbed underbrush, faint signs of campers who might have strayed from the trails. That night, though, something fell off. I can't describe it exactly. It wasn't fear at first. It was more like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. About 15 miles into my patrol, I came across a small clearing that I didn't recognize. I wasn't supposed to be in this area. The map showed only dense forest and a few narrow trails that rarely saw foot traffic. But there was a circle of flattened grass surrounded by tall pines, and in the center, something that made me freeze. A deer leg lay on the ground, freshly severed. The bone was clean, the blood dark and glistening in the faint moonlight. The rest of the deer was nowhere in sight. Nothing had decomposed yet, which meant it had been killed very recently. I shut off the engine and stepped out, boots crunching on the wet leaves. I scanned the surrounding forest carefully. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, not even the wind moving the trees. I crouched and examined the leg, noting the clean slice. Whoever or whatever had done this had used a sharp tool, likely human. I felt a chill run down my spine. Hunting accidents happen, but this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. I decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing, staying alert for any sign of whoever might have done this. Every few steps, the underbrush seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally. The smell of blood mingled with the damp earth, sharp in my nostrils. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating broken branches and deer tracks. Then I saw them, footprints. Human footprints, fresh, moving away from the clearing in no obvious direction. Some were deep, indicating heavy boots, others lighter, almost barefoot. They didn't follow a path, which meant whoever had done this was moving carefully, deliberately trying not to leave a trail. I felt a knot of tension in my stomach, but I kept moving. I had to report this, and I needed to know if this person or people were still nearby. I followed the footprints for nearly half an hour. The forest grew thicker, the trees more gnarled and twisted. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart between the trees, but whenever I turned to look directly, nothing was there. My heart was pounding, every snap of a twig underfoot making me start. Eventually, the footprints led to a steep embankment above a narrow creek. The embankment was muddy, and the track stopped abruptly at the edge. It was clear whoever had made them had climbed down into the creek bed and vanished into the darkness. I paused, trying to decide whether to follow. The creek was narrow but fast-moving, and the banks were slick with mud. Following them would be dangerous, and I had no backup. I took a deep breath and decided to mark the area for investigation and head back to the ranger station to report it. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed to relax slightly, the oppressive silence lifting just enough to hear the gentle rush of the creek and the whisper of leaves in the wind. Back in the truck, I radioed my location and details. Other rangers would come to investigate in the morning. By the time I returned to the station, the adrenaline had started to fade, replaced by a mix of relief and unease. Whoever had left that deer leg had been methodical, careful, and likely still out there somewhere in the forest. Over the next few days, patrols combed the area. They found more signs of human activity, makeshift traps, discarded tools, and tracks indicating that the person had been moving in and out of the forest regularly. But no confrontation ever occurred. The incident stayed with me. Every time I patrolled that area after that, I carried a heightened awareness. I knew that in a place as vast and isolated as that forest, humans could be as dangerous as any wild animal. And even though the immediate threat never returned, I learned a lesson that night that's hard to forget. The forest doesn't need ghosts or monsters to be terrifying. It's enough that it can hide people who don't belong, people capable of things you might never expect. In the end, the investigation concluded that the killings were likely tied to illegal hunting. Authorities increased surveillance, and over time, the incident stopped. The forest returned to its quiet rhythm, but I never forgot the feeling of that night. The way the shadows moved, the smell of blood in the damp air, and the stark reminder that danger often comes from the most ordinary source, another human. It was a chilling but clear lesson about vigilance, caution, and respect for the wild, and it changed the way I approached every patrol after that. I remember the first time I realized how unpredictable the forest could be, even after years of working as a park ranger. It was a late summer evening, and I had been assigned to patrol one of the more remote sections of the park, a dense stretch of pines and hardwoods that few visitors ever ventured into. The trail was rough, barely maintained, and the sun was slipping behind the hills, casting long, dark shadows across the narrow path. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine resin, and the forest was alive with the subtle rustling of unseen animals. I was riding my old, battered ATV, scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. That part of the park was known for its wildlife, but also for accidents. Hikers sometimes got lost here, hunters occasionally stumbled into dangerous situations, and there were even rare reports of poachers operating under the cover of night. I had my flashlight, radio, and standard ranger gear, but I knew that in places like this, you had to rely on more than just tools. You had to trust your instincts. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something odd. The trail ahead was littered with broken branches, and there were deep, fresh tire tracks that didn't match any of the official park vehicles. I slowed down, careful not to disturb anything, and shone my flashlight along the path. That's when I saw it. A deer, or at least what was left of it. The leg was severed cleanly, lying on the ground, flesh still raw, and there was no sign of decomposition. The air smelled faintly metallic. This had happened very recently. My stomach sank. This wasn't a natural predator kill. The cut was too clean, too deliberate. I radioed the station to report what I had found, but the static in my radio made it difficult to communicate. I gave a brief description, making sure to emphasize the urgency. The dispatcher told me to stay put and keep my distance. I backed the ATV up slightly, scanning the tree line for movement. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects muted, almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. My pulse quickened. I started following the trail of disturbances. Broken branches, scuffed earth, and occasional blood drops led deeper into the woods. The further I went, the more I realized that someone had been moving something heavy through here. There were footprints, too large to be human at first glance, but I quickly realized they were human, just in heavy boots. Whoever had done this was organized and likely dangerous. I didn't have a backup nearby. The thought made me tighten my grip on the flashlight and keep my hand near my service weapon, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it. The trail led me to a small clearing surrounded by thick underbrush. There, partially hidden by shrubs, I saw the rest of the deer. It had been skinned and partially butchered, and the work was recent. Whoever did this had left the carcass in a crude, almost methodical way. My heart was hammering. This wasn't just poaching. It was aggressive, calculated. I knew I had to be careful. Making noise could alert the person responsible, and being alone in a place like this at night was dangerous. I circled the clearing quietly, trying to find clues, and that's when I noticed tire tracks leading off a different path. They were smaller than the ones I'd seen before, maybe from an ATV or a small dirt bike. I debated whether to follow them. Following alone could be a mistake, but leaving the scene uninvestigated could allow this person to strike again. I decided to proceed cautiously, moving along the trail with the forest closing in around me. Every rustle made me tense, and I kept imagining shadows moving just out of sight. After what felt like an hour, I spotted a makeshift campsite tucked behind a thick stand of trees. It wasn't obvious at first, but the flattened grass, a small fire pit, and a tarp made from a hunting blind gave it away. I froze. Whoever was here had prepared for a stay. There were supplies, coolers, a small generator, tools, and traces of what appeared to be multiple kills stored nearby. The realization hit me hard. I had stumbled onto a professional poacher, and they had been using this area as a base for some time. I radioed back with as much information as I could, giving exact coordinates. They told me to keep a safe distance and wait for backup. I retreated carefully, marking the trail mentally so I could guide authorities. While waiting, I stayed hidden, watching the fire pit and listening. Hours passed. Eventually, the distant hum of vehicles and flashlights approaching broke the silence. The backup arrived, a team of rangers and a wildlife officer. Together, we carefully secured the area. There was no confrontation. The poacher had evidently left when they realized I had been nearby. They had vanished into the darkness, leaving evidence behind that would lead to a later arrest. By the time the sun rose, the forest seemed normal again, almost indifferent to the events of the night. The deer were recovered, evidence collected, and the area was marked for increased patrols. I walked back along the trail, exhausted, but with a sense of accomplishment. I had faced danger, relied on my training, and ultimately ensured that the forest and its wildlife were protected. That night reminded me that the woods were not just beautiful. They were alive, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. But it also reminded me why I had chosen this job: to stand watch, to protect, and to keep the balance, no matter how dark the night became. I had been a park ranger for almost 6 years, and I thought I'd seen just about everything this park could throw at me. I knew the trails, the streams, the hidden hollows where animals like to hide. I knew where the weather shifted suddenly, and I had learned to read the forest in ways most people never notice. But nothing, not a single incident in all my years, had prepared me for what I found one late afternoon in early October. I was making my usual rounds on the northern section of the park. That area was dense with old-growth forest, thick pine, and oak, their trunks mottled with moss and lichen. The trail was narrow, just barely wide enough for my truck, winding like a snake through the hills and valleys. I had been checking on the remote backcountry campsites, making sure the seasonal hikers had all left and that no one had left fires smoldering. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, turning the forest into a patchwork of shadows and gold, and I knew I had a couple more hours before I would need to head back to the ranger station. About 3 miles from the main road, I came across something that immediately set my stomach on edge. Across the dirt trail lay the remains of a deer. It wasn't old. Its eyes were still open, its body stiff but not decomposed. The deer had been shot or struck. I couldn't tell which at first. But there was no blood trail leading away and no tracks of a predator nearby. I crouched carefully and looked around. The forest was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I called it in on my radio, more out of habit than expectation. "Ranger Unit 5, I said, "I found a recently killed deer about 3 miles from the trailhead on the northern loop." There was static, then the familiar crackle. "Copy. Send a unit to pick it up tomorrow. You're cleared for inspection." I hung up, but my unease didn't go away. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong. I continued down the trail, my eyes scanning the underbrush. About 50 yards ahead, I noticed tire tracks, deep and wide, leading off the main trail and into the dense forest. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old, but the marks looked deliberate, like someone had intentionally avoided leaving a straight path. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I followed the tracks cautiously, my hand hovering over my sidearm, even though the chances of encountering someone dangerous were low. The tracks led to a small clearing, barely noticeable unless you were right on top of it. There were signs of recent activity, a makeshift fire pit, empty cans, and a tarp hanging from a tree. No people in sight, but footprints circled the clearing in different directions. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, and that's when I noticed it. Another deer carcass, partially covered with leaves. This one was worse. Its legs were broken at odd angles, as if someone had tried to move it, but failed. I felt my stomach tighten. Poachers, maybe. Illegal hunting happened occasionally, but the way these animals were treated was different. Careless, almost violent, not like normal hunting accidents. I documented the scene with photos and notes, careful not to disturb anything. The light was fading fast now, and the forest had gone from warm gold to deep blue shadows. I knew I needed to leave before darkness fully settled in. But as I turned to go, I noticed fresh tracks heading deeper into the woods, smaller than a human's, but too large to be an ordinary animal. Something about the pattern of the footprints made me hesitate. They weren't random. They circled, then disappeared toward a small creek. I listened. The forest was completely quiet now. Even the wind had stopped. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, the same thing that had kept me in this job for years, pushed me forward. I followed the tracks carefully, stepping softly on the moss-covered ground, moving from tree to tree like I had been trained to do. The creek was shallow, but the water was dark and cold. I noticed a small wooden platform along the bank, roughly built, with several more carcasses nearby. My stomach turned. Whoever had done this had created a kind of staging area, not for survival, but for sport. I realized then that these animals weren't just being killed. They were being tortured, displayed. I took photos quickly, documenting everything without touching. I stayed long enough to take careful notes, then retrace my path. Darkness fell completely as I made it back to my truck. The forest seemed alive in a different way now, every rustle and snap of a branch making me flinch. I drove slowly back toward the main road, headlights cutting narrow paths through the blackness. When I finally reached the ranger station, I reported everything to my supervisor and handed over the photos. The next morning, a team went in to investigate further. They found more evidence of illegal hunting, traps, and even remnants of baiting stations. The forest was scoured for a week, and the authorities eventually tracked down a small group of poachers who had been using this part of the park for months. They were arrested and charged with multiple counts of illegal hunting and animal cruelty. I never forgot that day. The forest returned to its usual rhythm, with deer, foxes, and raccoons moving freely again, and the eerie silence vanished. But every time I patrol that northern loop, I remember the stillness, the way the shadows clung to the trees, and the terrible evidence I stumbled across. I know now how fragile the peace of the wilderness can be, and how easily it can be broken by people who treat it carelessly. That day changed the way I see the forest. Not as a quiet, safe place, but as something alive, something that deserves respect, and something that can hide horrors in plain sight. Even years later, I still check that clearing whenever I drive past. It's empty now, and life has reclaimed it, but I know what once happened there. And I also know that the forest will always remember. I have been a park ranger for nearly 8 years, working in one of the most remote sections of the Cascade Mountains. The park was massive, spanning thousands of acres of dense forest, steep ridges, and hidden valleys. Most of the time, the work was routine, checking trails, maintaining signs, ensuring campers followed the rules. But sometimes the forest reminded you that you weren't in control. I never liked to admit it, but there were days when the forest felt alive in a way that made your stomach twist and your skin crawl. It was late September, and the nights were getting colder. I had volunteered for a solo overnight patrol along one of the less-traveled trails near the northern edge of the park. The trail was narrow, winding through towering pines, with only the faintest signs of previous hikers, some trampled underbrush and the occasional boot print in soft soil. The day had been long, and by late afternoon, the sun was already slanting through the trees, casting long shadows that moved like dark fingers across the forest floor. I had my backpack loaded with the usual gear: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, a small axe, some energy bars, and enough water for a full day. I also carried my standard ranger-issued Glock and a folding knife. I always felt safer with them on me, even though encounters with dangerous people were rare. Most of the threats came from the environment itself: wild animals, unstable terrain, or hikers who underestimated the wilderness. As I hiked deeper into the trail, I noticed something unusual: fresh footprints in the mud, too large to be a deer or other animal. I crouched to examine them. They were human. Boots, maybe men's size 10 or 11. The prints were sloppy, almost hurried, leading off the main trail and into a thicket of fir trees. My instincts screamed caution, but curiosity, dangerous as it was, pushed me forward. I followed the tracks slowly, keeping low and scanning the area for movement. The forest grew darker, denser. Fallen branches cracked under my boots. The scent of damp earth and pine needles was strong, mixed with a faint, sharp metallic smell that made me uneasy. After about 15 minutes, I stumbled into a small clearing, no more than 20 feet across. That's when I saw it. A deer, freshly killed, laid out unnaturally, its legs folded beneath it as if arranged by someone. The animal hadn't been there long. The blood was still wet. My heart rate spiked. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a hunter who had taken a shot and left. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. I scanned the surrounding trees, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. No sound of wings, no rustle of fur. Just silence. I radioed the ranger station, keeping my voice low. They acknowledged me and advised I stay put and keep my distance from the area. I didn't argue. I knew that humans could be far more dangerous than the wildlife out here. I backed slowly toward the main trail, keeping my eyes on the clearing. That's when I noticed the footprints leading away from the deer, deeper into the forest, heading toward a ridge that I knew was near a cliff face. Something compelled me to keep following, the same way you feel drawn to a car accident on the highway, even though it's dangerous. The trees closed in, branches scraping against my jacket, roots catching my boots. The air grew colder, thicker. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and jagged rocks. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like someone dragging something across the ground. My pulse quickened. I stopped, straining my ears. The sound repeated, irregular, coming from above, near the ridge. I knew the terrain there was treacherous. One misstep could send me tumbling down a cliff. I approached slowly, hugging the slope, flashlight steady. At the top of the ridge, I saw a small clearing, just large enough to reveal the edge of the cliff. And there it was, more deer, all laid out the same way, fresh blood glistening in the weak light of my flashlight. And then I saw footprints leading away from this clearing, deeper into the ridge, disappearing into a series of jagged rocks. Whoever, or whatever, had done this was still out there. I couldn't tell if they were watching me, hiding, or gone. I realized I had to make a choice. The trail behind me led back to safety, but I knew that if someone was up here, and armed or reckless, I could be at risk. I decided to retreat slowly, leaving marks on the dirt to track my path, keeping my eyes on every shadow. I kept my flashlight low to avoid drawing attention, moving step by step. As I made my way back to the main trail, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old hunting backpack ripped open with fresh blood stains. I didn't touch it. I radioed the station again, and they sent a team to meet me. When they arrived, we scouted the area together, carefully noting every detail. In the end, we discovered that a small, illegal poaching operation had been using that ridge to kill deer and process the meat before transporting it out under cover of darkness. They had been working in the area for weeks, and their activity was why the wildlife seemed restless, why the prints appeared fresh, and why the deer were found in those strange positions. The Park Service called in law enforcement, who tracked and apprehended the individuals responsible. The ridge was closed to the public temporarily for investigation, and signs were posted warning hikers of the dangerous terrain. I returned to that trail weeks later, during daylight, and the forest looked peaceful again, almost normal. But I never forgot that night, the cold sweat, the smell of blood, and the knowledge that someone had been so close, so human, and yet so capable of violence, hidden in the wilderness I thought I knew. It was a lesson I never forgot. The forest isn't just alive, it's indifferent, and the real danger doesn't come from shadows or legends. It comes from humans, and sometimes the most terrifying sights are perfectly real and chillingly close. I started my shift just as the last light of the sun was slipping behind the dense pines of the forest. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Autumn had painted the canopy with shades of gold and red, and the forest floor was a patchwork of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps as I patrolled the trails. Being a park ranger in this part of the country meant long stretches of solitude. Some days there was a relief, other days it gnawed at the edges of my mind. That evening, it would gnaw harder than usual. My shift began at the main ranger station, a small, weathered building tucked just off the entrance road. The old wood smelled faintly of pine and dust. I grabbed my standard gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My truck, a sturdy four-wheel drive with all-terrain tires, was already loaded with emergency supplies, extra blankets, and food rations. I checked the map on the dashboard, planning to cover a remote loop trail that wound deep into the forest. The area was notorious for lost hikers and occasional wildlife encounters, and I like to be thorough. As I drove down the dirt trail, the forest seemed to close around me. Trees bent overhead, forming a tunnel of shadow and rustling leaves. Birds had gone silent, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I slowed my truck, scanning the roadside for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. A fresh patch of disturbed soil, slightly damp, and right next to it, a deer's leg. Not decomposed, not dried, fresh, and stark against the brown leaves. My stomach tightened. There were no tracks of other animals nearby, just this solitary, unsettling sign. Whoever, or whatever, had left this, it hadn't been there long. I parked the truck a few yards away, trying to stay calm. The forest was thick, shadows stretching longer as the light faded. I crouched beside the leg, careful not to touch it more than necessary. Its clean separation from the body suggested a tool had been used, something sharp and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Predators usually left Messier work. Humans, that seemed more likely. I radioed dispatch to log the find, keeping my voice steady, reporting the location and details. The dispatcher noted it and reminded me to stay safe. I continued along the trail, alert, ears straining for any sound. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight carved a narrow cone of light ahead, illuminating the trunks and low-hanging branches. A low mist began to curl along the ground, obscuring the trail and giving the forest an unfamiliar, oppressive feel. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense. My training kicked in: observe, assess, maintain awareness, but instinct made my heartbeat pound like a drum. Hours passed. I found more signs: flattened brush, footprints too large for deer, some human-like in shape but blurred by the soft soil. The unease in my gut thickened. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They had stayed, and perhaps they were still there. I considered calling it in and retreating, but the thought of leaving evidence uninvestigated felt wrong. I was a ranger. It was my responsibility. By the time I reached a small clearing, night had fully settled. The moon barely shone through the canopy, leaving the forest wrapped in near-complete darkness. I stepped cautiously, scanning the clearing, when I noticed movement at the edge of my light. Something or someone ducking behind a tree. I froze, heart in my throat, hand gripping my flashlight and radio. The rustle of leaves came again, closer this time, deliberate. I backed slowly, keeping the light on the area. My mind ran through every possible outcome. I could retreat, I could call for backup, but leaving now could also put someone else at risk. I waited, tense, until I realized the movement had stopped. After several long minutes, I decided it was time to carefully leave the clearing and return to the main road. I kept my flashlight sweeping, moved deliberately, and every sound seemed amplified in the heavy silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the road. My truck's headlights cut through the darkness like beacons. I climbed in, locking the doors, and radioed dispatch with my final location. Backup was on its way. I stayed on the line, providing details about the disturbed areas and the tracks I'd seen. By the time I reached the ranger station, my body was exhausted, trembling slightly from adrenaline and tension. The next morning, a search team followed my trail, combing the forest thoroughly. They found evidence of someone having camped temporarily, signs of cutting and cleaning wildlife, but no one remained. It appeared that whoever had been there had left under cover of darkness, abandoning the area before discovery. Local authorities were notified, and warning signs were placed along the trails to keep hikers alert. I kept patrolling that section for weeks afterward. Each trip, I remained vigilant, and though nothing else unusual occurred, the memory of that night stayed with me. The stillness, the sense of being watched, and the knowledge that someone had been in the forest close enough that I might have encountered them if I had made one wrong move. But the work continued, as it always does. Life in the forest requires patience, caution, and respect for the unseen forces, human or otherwise, that share its space. Eventually, the area returned to normal. Trails reopened, hikers resumed their paths, and the forest settled into its familiar rhythm. The deer leg remained a mystery, but I took satisfaction in knowing I had handled the situation responsibly, keeping both visitors and the forest safe. That sense of control, earned through vigilance and training, is what a park ranger carries home after nights like that. Knowing you faced the unknown and came through without harm, ready to protect the forest another day. I remember the first time it really hit me how dangerous the forest could be, even when you think you know every trail and every shadow. I was working as a park ranger in the northern stretch of the Cascades. The area was remote, full of dense pine forests, steep ridges, and a network of narrow dirt roads that only rangers and a few locals dared to drive. It was late September, the kind of month when the days were still warm, but but the nights carried a sharp, biting chill. That morning, I had started my patrol earlier than usual because a hiker had reported a broken bridge along one of the trails. My job that day seemed simple: drive the main roads, check the bridge, and report back to headquarters. The first few hours were normal. The sun was low in the sky, shining through the tree canopy in gold and orange streaks. Birds were calling in the distance, and I saw deer grazing along a clearing. I parked my truck at the edge of the trail, grabbed my gear, and hiked the half-mile to the bridge. The structure itself was old, wooden, and partially rotted, but it had held up surprisingly well against years of rain and snow. I took photos, noted the damage, and was preparing to mark it for repairs when I noticed something unusual. The ground around the bridge looked recently disturbed, like someone had dragged something heavy. At first, I thought it might be fallen logs or debris washed down by the stream, but then I realized the drag marks were too linear, almost methodical. A sense of unease settled over me, but I pushed it aside. I started walking back toward my truck, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on fallen pine needles. That's when I saw it. A deer leg, freshly severed, lying in the dirt. I froze. The leg was cleanly cut, the blood still dark and sticky. Nothing else was around. No carcass, no tracks of other animals, just the leg. I checked the surrounding area carefully, scanning for any sign of a predator, human or otherwise. The tracks nearby were small, human-like, but muddy by recent rain. Someone had been here recently, and the thought made my stomach knot. I called it in over my radio, giving my location and describing the scene. The dispatcher advised me to stay put while they sent a unit, but before I could respond, I heard something. A faint rustling in the trees behind me. My instinct screamed to leave, but the truck was a 10-minute walk, and my radio's battery was low. The rustling grew louder, deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving carefully through the brush, keeping low and quiet. I slowly reached for my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on a patch of disturbed underbrush. Nothing was visible, but I could see the movement of shadows and hear twigs snapping under weight. Heart pounding, I decided to move back toward the truck slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows. The rustling followed me, always a few meters behind. Every step felt heavy. Every snap of a branch felt loud in the still forest. By the time I reached my truck, sweat was running down my back despite the cool air. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat inside, flashlight off, try to calm my breathing. I watched the darkness around the truck, and for several minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard it, heavy breathing, low and controlled, coming from the far side of the clearing. Whoever or whatever was out there was watching me. I tried radio again, my fingers shaking, and finally managed to get through to dispatch. They told me to stay inside and that a backup ranger team was on the way. 10 minutes felt like an hour. The breathing and snapping branches never stopped. I gripped my flashlight and my rifle, telling myself to stay calm. When the backup arrived, they drove up slowly, lights cutting through the darkness. The figure, or figures, I had since were gone by the time we searched the area. We found no other evidence, no human tracks beyond what I'd seen, nothing that explained the deer leg or the movement in the trees. We left the site, but the incident stayed with me. Over the next weeks, we investigated missing animals, possible poaching activity, and even illegal hunting traps, but nothing conclusive turned up. The area was remote enough that a poacher could operate for weeks without being noticed. I made it a point to patrol that trail every few days after that, always checking for drag marks, broken branches, or any sign of human interference. The forest, once familiar, became a place of constant vigilance. I never found the person responsible, but I learned a hard lesson. You can know the land perfectly and still be blind to what someone else might be doing in it. By the end of the season, I had marked the bridge for repairs, tightened security, and the forest slowly returned to its normal rhythms. But I never forgot the weight of that silence, the smell of fresh blood, or the way shadows moved when no one should be there. I understood then that being a ranger was not just about protecting the forest from fires or visitors. It was also about recognizing that the forest could hide things far more dangerous than wild animals. Things that moved quietly, methodically, and left no trace behind. It was the first time I truly understood that danger could exist in broad daylight, in plain sight, and that survival often depended on paying attention to the smallest details before it was too late. I remember the day like it was yesterday, even though it was years ago. I had been a park ranger for about 5 years at that point, stationed in a remote section of the forest that few people ever visited. The area was dense, with towering pines, thick underbrush, and a river that carved its way through moss-covered rocks. It was beautiful, peaceful most of the time, but there was a kind of raw unpredictability to it. That day started like any other. Morning patrols, checking trails, inspecting campsites, making sure everything was in order. I had been driving my Ranger truck along one of the less traveled dirt roads when I noticed something unusual on the side of the road. It was subtle at first, just a patch of brown against the green, but as I got closer I realized it was a deer leg, freshly severed, laying there on the forest floor. Nothing about it looked like it had decomposed. The blood was still dark and tacky. My stomach sank a little. I knew this meant a predator, or worse, something human, had been in the area recently. I parked the truck, pulled on my gloves, and approached cautiously. The rest of the animal was nowhere to be seen, just the leg and a trail of disturbed leaves leading deeper into the trees. I radioed back to headquarters, reporting the discovery and asking for advice. They told me to mark the spot and take photos, but the area was so remote that backup would take hours to arrive. So I started walking the trail, tracking the disturbed ground, hoping to find the rest of the deer. The forest was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch underfoot or the distant splash of water from the river. The air had a sharp, earthy smell, wet pine needles and soil mixed with something metallic, probably blood. As I followed the trail, the underbrush became thicker and the light filtering through the trees dimmed. I had a flashlight, but I didn't want to rely on it too early in the day. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally, and I kept glancing around, half expecting to see eyes staring back at me from the shadows. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, where I saw more evidence. Paw prints, large and irregular, pressed into the mud. They weren't from a bear or a deer. There was something heavier, something human-sized. My heart rate spiked. I had heard stories of poachers in the park, people willing to hunt illegally and leave animals in pieces. I followed the prints further, moving slowly and carefully, every sense on high alert. That's when I noticed the smell. It was stronger here, metallic and bitter. The prints led up to a small, abandoned cabin tucked into the trees. From the outside, it looked empty, falling apart, but the door was slightly ajar. I could see drag marks in the dirt leading inside, the same dark streaks that matched the deer leg. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin smelled of decay and iron. There were signs of recent activity, scraps of meat, overturned cans, and crude cuts in the wooden floor. Whoever had done this had been using the cabin as a temporary kill site, likely to butcher animals illegally. I stayed outside the cabin for a long time, calling in updates to headquarters. They told me to wait and not go in. So I circled the perimeter, checking for any signs of the person who had left this mess. Hours passed. Birds stopped singing, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I could hear water from the river, and occasionally a twig snapped somewhere in the distance. My stomach twisted every time. I stayed alert, waiting for movement, listening for human sounds or anything that shouldn't be there. Eventually, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint motor, like a small generator or a four-wheeler starting. I ducked behind a tree and watched. Through the thinning trees, I saw a figure emerge, someone dressed in dark clothing, carrying what looked like hunting gear. They were moving slowly, deliberately, scanning the area. I stayed hidden and called it in. By the time the park response team arrived, the figure had vanished into the trees, leaving only the cabin and the trail of evidence behind. The authorities examined the cabin and surrounding area. It turned out that a group of poachers had been using that remote part of the forest for weeks, illegally hunting deer and other wildlife, leaving carcasses scattered and barely concealing their tracks. They had been smart, moving at night and keeping the area off maps, but their mistakes caught up with them eventually. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the site, photographing evidence, and making sure nothing dangerous was left behind for unsuspecting hikers. By the time I returned to the ranger station, the sun was setting and the forest had gone quiet again, like nothing had happened. The smell of pine was strong in the evening air, and the forest seemed calm, almost serene. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that the area was temporarily safe and that the authorities were now tracking down the culprits. It was a grim reminder that the wilderness isn't just peaceful beauty. It's also a place where people can do dangerous things, and sometimes it takes a long time for justice to catch up. That night, I went home exhausted, muddy, and still carrying the smell of the forest and blood. I thought about the deer, about the poachers, and about how easy it was for the quiet, untouched parts of the forest to hide terrible things. But there was closure too. The poachers were caught soon after, and the forest slowly returned to its natural rhythm. I kept patrolling that area for years, but I never found another scene like that. It left me with a mix of respect and caution for the forest, a reminder that even in the calmest, most beautiful places, danger can hide in plain sight. I was working the late shift as a park ranger in one of the most remote sections of the forest I'd ever patrolled. The park itself covered thousands of acres, but the part one was assigned was tucked away behind winding dirt roads and dense pine groves that blocked out most of the sunlight, even in the middle of the day. I'd been working here for 3 summers, and while the place was isolated, I had a rhythm to the job. I knew where the dangerous cliffs were, where hikers often got lost, and which streams ran dry in the summer. I also knew the forest had a way of making a person feel small, almost invisible, if they weren't careful. That evening, I started my shift just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles, a smell that always felt sharper in the fading light. I drove slowly down the narrow ranger roads, keeping my headlights on low so I wouldn't blind any nocturnal animals. I always carry my radio, flashlight, first aid kit, and a small hunting knife, standard precautions for someone working alone in this part of the forest. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I checked on the trailheads, ensuring the signs were intact and that no one had left large amounts of trash behind. The trails themselves were quiet, the only sounds the occasional snap of a branch underfoot or the distant rustle of something moving through the underbrush. As darkness deepened, I started my routine of checking the more remote camping areas. These spots were popular with hunters and hikers who wanted solitude, but they also came with risks. One of the campgrounds was built on a slope near a small creek. Usually, it was abandoned by this time of year, but I had learned never to assume anything. When I arrived at that particular campground, I immediately noticed something off. The ground was disturbed, as if someone or something had moved through it recently. Leaves and twigs were scattered, and the grass near the creek was trampled in a pattern that didn't make sense for a hiker's boots. As I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminated something that made my stomach tighten. A deer carcass lying in the shallow creek, its leg broken off and the rest of the body partially submerged. The animal hadn't decomposed yet. Its eyes were still open, wide, frozen in shock. Whoever or whatever had done this had been here very recently. I radioed in a brief report to the main ranger station, careful not to speculate. They told me to keep my distance and wait for backup from the wildlife officers. The forest, though familiar to me, suddenly felt different. Shadows seemed sharper, the wind through the trees colder. I decided to walk the perimeter of the creek, keeping my flashlight sweeping slowly across the dark water and dense underbrush. The sound of the creek moving over rocks was hypnotic, but I kept my senses sharp. Something about this didn't feel like normal predator activity. Wolves, bears, and even coyotes had predictable patterns. This was messy, unnatural. As I circled back toward my truck, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something shifted in the trees, just beyond the reach of my light. I froze, listening. There was a low, guttural sound, almost a growl, but not quite. I strained to see, scanning the darkness, and then I saw it. A figure crouched low, half hidden by the thick pine shadows. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculating, and it stayed just out of reach of the light. My heart was pounding, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I knew the forest, I knew how to survive out here alone, and I wasn't going to make any mistakes that could get me hurt. I slowly backed toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the figure. It didn't chase me, didn't move aggressively, just watched. I reached the truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it. From inside, I could see the headlights casting long, sharp shadows across the campground. The figure melted back into the trees, as if it had never been there. I called the station again and described everything I'd seen. They told me to stay put, and within an hour, wildlife officers arrived with additional rangers. The investigation revealed something I had not expected. The deer's leg had been taken by a poacher, a human who had been hunting illegally in the area. They had set traps near the creek and were taking parts of animals to sell. The figure I saw in the trees had likely been the same person, hiding and watching me, possibly planning to come back once it was safe. The poacher was eventually caught a few weeks later, after careful tracking and setting up surveillance cameras throughout the area. After the incident, the forest didn't feel quite as safe, but it didn't feel malevolent either. I resumed my patrols, more vigilant than before, but with a renewed respect for the reality of the dangers humans can bring into the wilderness. The deer's death had been violent and sudden, but justice was served, and the forest continued its slow, patient rhythm. Life went on in its quiet, unforgiving way, and I remained there, keeping watch, learning again that fear often comes not from shadows or myths, but from the presence of another living being with intent. By the end of the summer, I had grown more attuned to the subtleties of the forest. Every sound, every shadow, every unusual disturbance in the undergrowth. It was a reminder that while the wilderness itself was indifferent, people were unpredictable. The forest had tested me that night, and I had learned to respect its lessons. And that, in the end, was enough to make me feel prepared for whatever came next. I had been a park ranger for nearly 7 years at a sprawling national forest in the Northern Rockies. The kind of place where the trees stretch so high that even at noon, shadows stretch long across the ground, and the air carries a constant, damp, earthy scent. Most days were routine, patrolling trails, checking on hikers, looking out for illegal campers or hunters, but there were nights when the forest reminded you just how unpredictable and raw it could be. One of those nights I'll never forget. It was early October, right after the first frost had started to creep into the lower elevations. I was finishing up a long solo patrol on one of the more remote northwestern trails, a place the visitors rarely ventured. The sun had dipped behind the mountains hours ago, and the forest had taken on a deep, shadowy quiet. I switched on my headlamp, which barely penetrated the dense blackness beyond the trail, and checked the map on my tablet. The plan was to make a full loop and get back to my ranger station before midnight. A couple of miles in, I noticed something unusual on the trail. There was a faint set of tire tracks, too narrow for a standard pickup, leading off into the trees about 50 feet from the trail. They weren't fresh enough to be slick with mud, but they were recent enough that the grass around them was pressed down. At first, I figured it was just someone using a dirt bike illegally. That happens more than you'd think, even in areas with strict rules. But something about the way the tracks veered sharply downhill made my stomach tense. That part of the forest was nearly inaccessible, a slope so steep and rocky that even an ATV would struggle. I decided to investigate, walking slowly along the tracks. The forest floor was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and sharp rocks. Every step I took made the dry leaves crackle, echoing unnaturally in the still night air. The tracks led to a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to see a makeshift campsite. A fire pit had been hastily constructed, and there were scraps of packaging, food wrappers, a torn piece of sleeping bag, and a half-empty backpack leaning against a tree. It looked abandoned, but the details didn't sit right. The sleeping bag looked like it had been used recently, and the fire pit had ash that hadn't fully cooled. I started a careful perimeter check, scanning with my flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a line of small, smeared footprints leading into the woods from the campsite. They were human, no bigger than a teenager's, but irregular. It looked like someone had been in a hurry, maybe even limping. The deeper I followed them, the quieter the forest became. My headlamp barely reached 10 feet ahead, and the trees became thicker. The footprints vanished near a fallen log, but I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trunks. I froze. My hand instinctively went to my radio, but the signal was spotty in that part of the forest. I whispered into it anyway, stating my location. No reply. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but my gut told me otherwise. The tracks, the campsite, the abrupt movement, they didn't line up with normal wildlife activity. I slowly turned back to head toward the trail when I saw it. A figure crouched low behind a thick tree, barely moving. I couldn't make out features in the dark, but I could feel its eyes on me. My first instinct was to retreat, but the slope behind me was steep, and I was alone. I stayed frozen, waiting, my heart hammering. Then, without a sound, the figure slipped further into the shadows and disappeared. I waited several long minutes, listening. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, just the oppressive quiet of the forest. Realizing I couldn't stay there forever, I carefully backtracked to the trail, my senses on high alert. My mind raced, thinking of possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone hiding? Or something worse? Someone using the forest as a place to escape the law? I reached my truck after nearly 30 minutes, the beams of the headlights cutting through the dark. The relief hit me like a wave. I locked the doors and radioed my supervisor. By the time law enforcement arrived to investigate, there was no one at the campsite, and the tracks had been partially washed out by the cold evening wind. The official report concluded that it was likely a trespasser who had set up a temporary camp and moved on, but I knew better. There was something calculated in the way the campsite had been abandoned. Something that suggested whoever it was, they had been watching the trail, waiting for the right moment. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Replaying the shadow, the footprints, the cold certainty that someone had been close enough to touch me if they had wanted to. Weeks later, the forest returned to its usual quiet. I kept patrolling the same area, always checking for traces of campsites or tracks, and I never saw the figure again. But the experience changed how I approached the forest. I learned to respect the darkness, to trust instinct over logic, and to never underestimate the isolation of the wilderness. The forest isn't haunted by ghosts. It doesn't need to be. Its scariest moments are made of real things. Shadows, silence, and the knowledge that you might not be alone, even when it seems like you are.